Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the final event of our 2022 Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference virtual workshop series called Electrify Everything, sponsored by the Alaska Center for Energy and Power at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm Gwen Holdmann, the director of the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. ACEP's an applied energy research program that conducts research that's relevant and timely for Alaska's communities and our industries. And one of our goals is to disseminate information to interested Alaskans about things that are happening both in Alaska and in other markets that could have relevance to Alaska. And so this workshop is one example of this. It's actually part of a series of 4 workshops, and we selected them as topics leading up to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, which is going to be happening May 24th through 26th, hosted by the administration at the Denina Center in Anchorage, an in-person event. There's also a component where you can actually participate remotely, but we're hoping that we'll have a lot of people showing up there in person as an opportunity to really connect with one another. The topics that we've selected were topics for this workshop series that we thought deserved a little bit of a deeper dive than is possible at a really high level, all-encompassing conference like the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. And so we picked these topics starting in January with nuclear energy, in February, ocean, river, and hydrokinetic energy. And then last month we did hydrogen in the high north. Recordings of those workshops are available on the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website. And I think Michelle's going to provide a little more information on how to access those for anyone who is interested later, because there's really a wealth of information that is there. We've had some really fantastic speakers, not only from Alaska, but really from not around the country and also globally for some of those workshops. This one, it's definitely one of the ones I've been the most excited about because beneficial electrification is actually the newest research focus area for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. Over time, we've sort of selected areas that we think deserve a little bit more attention and a little bit more organized research emphasis, where we're really building capacity around building up research programs in certain areas. And this is one that we stood up a little bit over a year ago, working with a number of different partners, many of which you'll hear from here during this workshop. But this broader area of beneficial electrification feels like a really quickly evolving landscape in the energy industry, and one, at least in Alaska, that's largely been pioneered by our rural communities and our rural utilities with regard to dispatchable, mostly thermal loads to support integration of variable renewables. So it'll be good to hear from some of those speakers. For ACEP, our beneficial electrification program adds another E to it, beneficial and equitable electrification. And that's a really important nuance for ACEP researchers, and sometimes something we've spent a lot of time talking about. This initiative was really spun out of work that we did through our Anchorage office and work that they've been doing related to electric vehicles. And then combining that with a more general focus on opportunities for using electric power for meeting other energy demands, including not just transportation through electric vehicles, but also things like heating loads, like heat pumps, or through dispatchable thermoelectric stoves. At ACEP, we're not just the Alaska Center for Power. That energy and power part is a really important thing, and we really look at energy from a pretty holistic standpoint. I think that's very important, especially because electric power is really only about a third of the energy that we use, especially in more rural parts of the state. Heating, transportation are really important loads for us too, and so that sort of more holistic role or approach is something that we really pride ourselves in taking. And really hope to sort of use some of the lessons learned and the exciting work that's being done in Alaska and outside of Alaska as ways that we can increase utilization of local energy resources whenever possible. I think in general, there's a widespread consensus that electric power is going to become a more and more important component of our energy mix over time. And so thinking about what that looks like in the Alaska context is pretty important. And through all this, we have partnered with a lot of different organizations on this effort, many of which you'll hear from during this workshop. But one of our most important partners is the Alaska Energy Authority. And so with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Curtis Thayer, the Director of the Alaska Energy Authority, to make some opening remarks for us today. Welcome, Curtis. And
thank you, Gwen, very much for that. Really appreciate the introduction and appreciate the working relationship that we have with ACEP. And really, this workshop is exciting because really this is what AEA is all about. And that's the electrification and opportunities in Alaska. We've enjoyed a long-term partnership with ACEP, and we're pleased to be part of these discussions leading up to the first Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. A little bit about us. AEA is the State Energy Office and the lead agency for statewide policy and program development for the state. Our mission is a simple one, and that's to reduce the cost of energy in Alaska. And there's several ways that we go about achieving that. First, we're involved in power generation and transmission on the Railbelt, which is interconnected to the electrical grid from Fairbanks to Homer. AEA owns Bradley Lake Hydro Project, the largest in the state at 120 megawatts. And we also own what we call the SSQ line through Cooper Landing, intertie. And then we own the intertie from Willow to Healy that saves the Fairbanks consumers over $30 million a year for them to be able to buy power in South Central and use it in Fairbanks. When we're also very excited about looking at expanding Bradley Lake, what we call the Dixon diversion. We diverted Battle Creek into the lake, into Bradley Lake 2 years ago. It was a success. We kind of set our sights a little higher, looking at another diversion project. They could, right now, Bradley provides electrifies 54,000 homes. We hope that the Dixon diversion will possibly add 30,000 homes to that number. And during the last 20 years, AEA has designed and constructed more than 90 powerhouses in rural Alaska. Most of these are diesel powered, although some primarily run on hydro and other renewables and wind and solar. A program that we currently have that we're extremely proud of is the Renewable Energy Fund. Over 80% of those, that funding looks at alternative energy in rural Alaska, about 20% on urban. The state has invested almost $300 million in that program. And so it's one that clearly has a success rate, but we've been able to, with the Renewable Energy Program, be able to take away 30 million gallons of diesel fuel that would otherwise be used in the powerhouses in rural Alaska. AEA's experience with design and construction of generation, transmission, and distributed heating systems all over Alaska. And we are continuing to look at the ocean and river hydrokinetic energy resources that contribute to our power needs. And we look to ACEP as a partner in that, as really a leader in that. AEA has been engaged in the electrification, specifically its own EV program. We were initially received funding from the Volkswagen settlement from 2018. It was the Environmental Mitigation Summit, Mitigation Trust. And since then, AEA has worked on developing an electric vehicle working group. And we were able to stand up 9 charging stations from Homer to Healy. This last summer still in construction. I was just in Seward. That one is being constructed right now. And we awarded nearly $1 million in grants. And we partnered with the private sector who provided another $500,000 in that case. We also started having ribbon cutting ceremonies. We unveiled new electric charging stations in Anchorage at the courthouse and at the state office building. And we've also partnered with the Alaska EV Association and hosted the first ever EV car show. And in the infrastructure bill, the IIJA bill, there's $50 million of program money for Alaska that we're partnering with DOT at electrifying the highway corridor. That not only means from Homer to Fairbanks, Fairbanks to Tok and Delta, but also the Alaska Marine Highway System and the communities in Southeast and Kodiak. And so that should be a very, very, very big project that we're going to undertake, but we're going to be looking to partners and site hosts and working with the local communities and governments and utilities, especially to figure out how that grid best works for Alaska. We also will be accessing funds to develop and submit a proposal for energy plan this year for an energy plan for this year. And we also stand in the IIJ for $60 million over the next 5 years to improve the grid, the transmission grid across Alaska. That's $12 million a year. And so that's an exciting part to start looking at not only the Railbelt, but what we can focus on in other parts of Alaska to improve the electrical grid. We still have trust funds from the EV, from the Volkswagen settlement to put towards EV. So we're going to do a lot of planning and working with the communities on that. And we continue to look at different funding opportunities to support and affordable EV drivers for across the country. And so there's a lot happening at Alaska Energy Authority, not only from the powerhouses to the intertie, but especially electric vehicles. And now we're looking at upgrading the transmission lines, because as we look at adding renewables to the transmission lines, we need to increase the capacity of those lines. We have a bottleneck on the Kenai Peninsula. We want to get that bottleneck undone. And with that, we want to hope to lower the cost of the Railbelt. And if the cost of the Railbelt is lower, it actually lowers the floor on PCE and makes more money available for rural Alaska in the formula that was established by the legislature. So with everything happening, we really appreciate today. I hope to be in and out of the conference. I do have a 9 a.m. with House Finance on a bill of ours. But at this point, I'd like to turn it back to you, Gwen, and for your team and all their hard work today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Curtis. Yeah, I guess as we're getting to the end of the session there's a lot of last minute activities. So I know we're all sort of tracking some of that in Juneau. So we appreciate you taking the time here this morning to join us, and looking forward to seeing you and other participants at the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference here later on this month. I can't believe it's already May.
I know.
So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the MC for this workshop, for this week's event, Michelle Wilbur. Michelle leads our Beneficial and Equitable Electrification Program at ACEP and is one of our very talented young research engineers. She's been working really closely with the team at Government Event Services and their fantastic group that has done a lot of the work behind the scenes to make these workshops successful. And it's kind of interesting because when I first floated the idea to Michelle about putting this workshop on earlier this year, everyone's always a little concerned about their workload and how is this going to balance with other commitments that I already have. But she was immediately like, yes, let's do this. This is a great idea. And her enthusiasm has really infused all of the planning for this workshop, along with the rest of the B team that has really helped her out with that. So we always kind of joke that the B team is really the A team at ACEP. But in addition, the thing I like about Michelle, and you guys can look at her bio that's available, but in addition to being a really competent technologist, she's somebody who I really personally admire, because she's somebody who really walks the walk in her personal life and doesn't just talk the talk. She's very, very conscientious about her own energy footprint, and that extends not only to direct energy use, but also things like local food production and growing what she can herself on her own little parcel in Anchorage. And so she's really the one that really was the most responsible for adding that second E, that equitable, to our B program and the mission that we put together for that. And so she's somebody that inspires me every time I interact with her. And she's got a very positive attitude and deep thoughtfulness about energy issues for Alaska. So Michelle, welcome. And why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thank you so much, Gwen. It's definitely a pleasure to work with you at ACEP. And I should say two things. One, when you call me young, we're pretty much exactly the same age, more or less. And also, Gwen, some people may know this, cools her food with the coolness of the earth. So she also is walking the chalk. But we're very excited to welcome all of you today and tomorrow for these 2 half-day workshops full of interesting and stimulating sessions and materials. So this series of 4 workshops has been held monthly, free of charge, leading up to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference happening in person, May 24th through 26th at the Denina Center in Anchorage, Alaska. There are both in-person and virtual tickets available for the conference still. We hope you'll consider joining us for this inaugural event. Should be wonderful. I'm really looking forward to it. You can get those tickets now. You can purchase them at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com. So there was a first virtual workshop, Nuclear Energy in Alaska, that was held in February. There was a second one, Ocean and River Energy in Alaska, that was held in March. And then the third virtual workshop, Hydrogen in the High North, was held in April. And these are all research directions that ACEP is looking into. So our fourth and final virtual workshop happening today is Electrify Everything, ? Which will include presentations from many speakers that will be sharing their knowledge, expertise, experiences in this field over the next 2 days. I'm very excited about this. We're honored to have everybody with us. I will also say that this whole workshop has been a big team effort. The Beneficial and Equitable Electrification Initiative at ACEP has a number of members that participate fairly regularly, and we are an amazing group. I'm very happy to have that support. So I'm looking forward to our time together today, and the agenda is up on the screen for a daily program overview. So session 1 is today. We've gotten started. We're having a welcome introduction, a special speaker coming up. And then we'll go into our first panel at 9 a.m. on early adopters in Alaska communities. And then we'll move into the second panel of the day. And that will be the cutting edge research panel, and we will end at noon Alaska time. So we are building today on last year's Electrify Alaska conference that happened in Cordova, organized by Clay Copeland. So today we're again bringing together Alaskan and outside perspectives from early adopters, utilities, researchers, and industry. We're all planning to learn from each other and plot the course for the future of electrification in Alaska, including by illuminating the places where there's a need for further research and work to ensure that the transition is equitably beneficial for all Alaskans. So we have some different conditions up here. Alaskans talk about how different we are, and in some cases that's really true. And so we really need to make sure that we know how to make this transition benefit everybody. So we're going to start off today to get you all kind of make sure your coffee's working or your tea or whatever. We're going to do an engagement poll. So we're going to do an interactive map where we can look at where all of you are joining us from today. So to participate from your computer, go to pollev.com/toteak216. That's on the screen and should be in the chat. The recommendation apparently is to use Google Chrome. I do not use Google Chrome. I use Firefox, but supposedly Google Chrome has the best results. Good luck with whatever your browser is. So you can also text the TOTEAK216 or 22333 to participate in the poll. You'll get a message once you've joined the session, and you can type and send your response to pop up on the next screen. So for the first activity, once you get to the map, just drop a pin on the map to show us where you're joining us from today. And so that map is up on the screen, and unsurprisingly, there are quite a number of people joining from Alaska. It looks like it kind of broadly mirrors the population of the population centers of Alaska. Looks like we've got folks from Railbelt and Southeast and all over Alaska, and then from the United States as well, the lower 48. I'm not really seeing any pins on other parts, but exciting. I'm sure we'll have people join from various places in the world at different points during this session, because I know some of our speakers are from outside of the US. So very exciting stuff. And moving on, and hopefully everybody had a chance to put your pin on there. Thank you for participating in that poll. Now we'll go over a few housekeeping items. So if everyone would please introduce yourself in the chat, that would be wonderful. You can let us know your name and the organization that you're representing or joining from. Our presenters have created their presentations to be as engaging as possible, so please continue to participate in the poll, submit questions in the chat, join in the various activities that are planned. If you're having any difficulties with audio or trouble viewing the presentation, send a direct chat message to event support for assistance. So in the chat, you can select the person you're sending to and select event support if you're having any issues. During the workshop, all attendees will be muted, so you can submit questions or comments using the chat feature, and moderators will read the questions to the panelists at the end of each panel as there's time, or the presenters will answer questions directly in the chat. And certainly side communication, everything is quite welcome in the chat. That adds dimension to this. A recording of the workshop will be available on the ASEC, that's the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website, which is at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com/virtual workshop, and at a later date. So continue to check back for more information. If you registered, you should continue to get emails with that information. And we're really glad to have you here with us live today to Everything You Can Make. So it is now my pleasure to introduce you to the Chief Executive Officer of Cordova Electric Cooperative. Clay Copeland is somebody I really admire. He is both the CEO of Cordova Electric and also the mayor of Cordova, and he is a powerhouse of energy. You know, he hunts, he fishes, he gardens, he finds time to do all of his work, and he is very involved in the energy transition, implementing very innovative things with Cordova Electric and Cordova, thinking deeply about electric vehicles and other new technologies and how that can fit in to make the most reliable and innovative and renewable grid he can in Cordova. And he led us off in this direction last year with the Electrify Alaska conference in Cordova, which was pretty much the first thing I traveled to after a very long virtual life of COVID. So really appreciate that. And without further ado, I should say that please remember that you can submit questions for Clay in the chat box to be addressed after the presentation. But please join me in a very warm welcome for Clay.
Hey, thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today, and just kind of wanted to start the conversation on Electrify Everything with an overview and some of the thinking that went into hosting the Beneficial Electrification Conference for Alaska. So we say electrify everything, but do we really mean everything, and why would we want to electrify everything? So I thought I'd start with just kind of an overview of what electric energy is from my perspective, and why it's important to think about it maybe a little differently than we have in the past. So I see electric energy as mechanical energy. It's most efficiently produced when you convert kinetic energy to electric energy. So if you want to convert the motion of water to electricity, you can achieve up to 95% efficiencies at the electric generator. Incredibly efficient. It's also very efficiently used as kinetic energy. So if you want to use electricity to drive things that spin, like pumps and motors, so forth, it's very efficient. But when we say it's very efficient, we have to be careful, because you can take a resistive heater and supply electricity to that, and it's also very efficient in terms of converting electricity to heat. It's just that it takes a tremendous amount. What you're really doing is taking all that mechanical energy and you're using it all up as friction, and that is what generates the heat. So while you can efficiently convert electricity directly to heat, it takes a tremendous amount of electricity to generate any meaningful amount of heat. I remind people in Cordova, just turning on a blow dryer with a heating element uses 3 to 4 times as much as the average use of your entire home. So an analogy I like to use is you can rub 2 sticks together and try to generate heat that way with friction, but it's so much easier to just put them in your wood stove. So the big takeaway from that concept is that it's best to produce electricity mechanically and use it mechanically from an efficiency and overall energy use perspective. And it's most efficient to generate thermal energy, use thermal resources to generate thermal energy. We all know that solar thermal panels are much more efficient at converting sunlight to energy than photovoltaics, for example. So I just wanted to kind of start with that little background, and that will bear on some of the new technologies that we have in front of us and opportunities that we have. So And again, I guess just to outline some of those heat sources are solar energy, fossil fuels, geothermal, even the latent environmental heat in air, water, and ground. So what I call kind of the golden path of generating electricity with renewables, mechanical renewables, using them, or displacing fossil fuel use on the user side with renewable generated electricity, and then sequestering heat that's around us out of the water and air and the ground, instead of releasing kind of sequestered heat that's locked up in fossil fuels, is really kind of a tripling down on climate change. You're taking the fossil fuel out of the supply, you're taking the fossil fuel out of the user side, and you're sequestering and holding and storing heat instead of releasing it into the environment. So why electrify everything? Why do we want to electrify, and where should we do it? Locally sourced and used energy, especially in our rural communities, but even Anchorage and our larger communities, are challenged by economies of scale and the need to import energy. So locally sourced and locally used energy is more efficient in terms of transport, but it can also be more affordable where the resources that are locally available match the needs that are locally available. And that isn't every case, and it's not every use. So you have to be careful where you apply the renewable energy and the electric energy. Locally sourced energy has critical security elements. To me, the social, financial, and even psychological impacts of producing your energy locally and being independent in that regard is very important in the dynamic and challenging environments we live in. And electrifying can contribute to more reliable and affordable solutions, especially with the new technologies that I'll walk through here in a sec. So, and of course, it can help offset climate change and air and water pollution. I'll have to say I just recently have become more and more convinced of the extent that human interaction contributes to climate change. And I would really encourage a reference that I really appreciated, which is Energy for Future Presidents by Richard Moeller. There are also great sections in there on all the different technologies that speak to some of these elements. And it's a good companion to all the other training information out there in the energy ecosystem. But so some of the great new opportunities that we have for technologies to use electricity, of course, electric vehicles. And again, they're mechanical use. So you can push up to 30% overall round trip efficiency. Water flowing down a mountainside, 30% of that energy can end up pushing a car down the road. Fossil fuels struggle to even reach 10% round trip efficiency. You look at the wells to wheels cost of producing oil, refining it, delivering it, very inefficient. So some of the technologies we looked at in our Electrify Alaska conference, electric boats, Evergreen down in Juneau, aviation, Ampere, and many others that are starting to electrify flight. Energy storage is another important element of energy electrification. Battery energy storage, and especially compelling for Alaska, is a look at hydrogen. And some of the fringe technologies, data analytics, holistic approaches to trying to maximize the social benefit of energy electrification, particularly through education opportunities like teaching through technology, upward bound, and helping to develop that workforce development pipeline into these energy opportunities. And then smart grid and smart city technologies for new interactive, transactive grids and platforms that help better marry our electric production to our electric use in more of a transactive way. Just a final thought, hydropower and nuclear share several common traits. One is that they're the most reliable, lowest levelized cost of energy and lowest kilowatt hour rate. That means the lowest kilowatt hour rate over the life of the project. Firm power resources, which mean they're fully available at full output anytime we need them. And we need to take a harder look at those. They both face some headwinds in terms of public perceptions. I would go as far as to say misconceptions. And in the case of hydro, a back to the future look in the context of climate change, in recognizing that flood control, drought mitigation, some of the storage of water for agriculture and drinking is maybe a lot more important in the context of climate change. And that value, I'm not even going to call it a secondary value, it might be the primary value of storing large volumes of water in addition to generating electricity, actually takes us back to why hydro was developed in the first place. The energy was an add-on benefit for all the other benefits. And that technology hasn't changed much. Nuclear, on the other hand, is evolving technologically and very rapidly. And like hydro, it offers a critical value stream that rivals or exceeds the electricity, which, especially in Arctic and Alaska markets, is the heat. So the new smaller scaled use of lower enriched fuels, the passive cooling, modular reactors, they're not your mother's nuclear. We need to take a close look and continue to take a close look and be involved in the conversation of nuclear. And I see you have that on your agenda. So we've had military bases, and Copper Valley Electric have committed to pursuing nuclear energy solutions. So I just wanted to finish on that note of a couple of applies and maybe another look that we need to take at those. And wish you to have a great workshop today. And thanks again for the opportunity to join you.
Thank you so much, Clay, for those words. I appreciate you being here. We are going to transition right away to today's first session. Panel 1 will include 4 presentations ending at approximately 10:20. We might run a couple minutes over into the break to give everybody a full chance to speak and follow with a group question and answer session. As a reminder, during this session, questions can be submitted via the chat box and will be addressed during the Q&A, or if your question is not addressed during the Q&A, hopefully the speaker you're addressing it to or some member of the panel will come on to the chat and address it there. So please join me in welcoming our first moderator, who will be introducing our panel 1 participants. So it's really my honor to work closely with Chris Pike. He is a close teammate of mine in Anchorage. We work together on solar and beneficial and equitable electrification projects and a whole host of other things, decarbonization and everything else. And Chris is a really wonderful person to work with. He has a lot of skills, both hands-on and modeling and dealing with data. And I just can't imagine a better research partner. So welcome everybody, research engineer for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, Chris Pike.
Thank you, Michelle, for the very kind introduction there. I'm very excited to be here to moderate this very first panel of our workshop, where we will discuss the early adoption of heat and transportation, specifically around electrification. As you can see by the names beside me, we have a very distinguished panel of speakers today, many with decades and decades of experience working in this field. As Michelle indicated, each panelist will give approximately a 15-minute presentation. And then when all the panelists are done, we'll follow that with about a 20-minute question and answer period. Depending upon the length of presentations for each panelist, we may sneak in a question or two after their specific presentation. But I encourage everybody to put their questions in the chat, and I will do my best to keep track of those and to bring them up as they are appropriate. It is my pleasure to welcome our first presenter, Ingemar Mathiason. Ingemar has 12 years involvement with energy projects in Alaska and specifically in the Northwest Arctic Borough. In addition, he's been participating in the statewide effort to bring forth an Alaska energy plan, specifically taking a look at regional and collaborative approaches. So please join me in welcoming Ingemar. Ingemar, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, ACEP, for putting on this virtual workshop so we can all share information and best practices. I'm going to try to step us through to why we decided to go for heat pumps up in the Northwest Arctic, and I'll start sharing my screen. In the Northwest Arctic, of course, we are above the Arctic Circle, and it's an expensive proposition to live up there. I'm going to step through some different slides. Energy efficiency has been with the Northwest Arctic from the very beginning. Up in the left corner, you may recognize an original Eskimo sealed blubber lamp that was used both for light and for cooking in previous times. The Northwest Arctic has decided that we needed, since 2008, to start developing all available energy sources that are local, both renewable and non-renewable. We're looking at both, and definitely goes towards renewables, as we also added to combat the rapid climate change and greenhouse gas emissions since about 2016, when we changed the plan slightly. So we've been doing about 10% decrease of imported diesels, and is on track now for possibly 25% by 2030, aiming for 50% by 2050. You know this page from a lot of different areas. You see that, of course, out in the world, the oil is constantly switching up and down depending on conflicts out there, not the least the latest where we are now, and who knows how long that will go on at Ukraine. However, in the Northwest Arctic, even though the lower 48 might go up and down, we are not going up and down as much. And now we're climbing up above where we were before. And the gas and oil prices and gasoline prices are constantly increasing. This is where we were in 2019. In 2019, the red is, of course, the increases in fuel cost. And there was a slight decrease at that time in a few of the villages. But by 2022, it's now looking like that. We have no attack at $16 retail fuel. $17.50 was one of the shipment in by AVAC lately. And Ambler was just added, and Shungnak, where the last two fuel deliveries were 731 and 946 landed. It should also be noted that there is a big difference here between cost of AVAC's prices coming in with barge, even flown in, versus the retail prices, as you can see here for Ambler in particular, or $16 in no attack, and so on. This affects the electric rates, of course, too. In 2019, this is the rates that we had, and the reds went up in those terms. I want to point out one thing here that will bear on my presentation a little bit later here, and that is this is, of course, the PCE rates in the first column, and the actual PCE rate with the tax that the different communities are adding on. Like in Selawik, there's 7% tax, so they end up at 25 cents, right? And then you have about 58 cents between 500 and 700 under AVAC, and 48 cents above 700. This decrease here has impact when it comes to community buildings, as you're going to see later here. Here's the 2022 prices, which just went up even more, of course. The no attack one is likely to head towards $1 here. I don't think it's been adjusted yet. There's two cases that, two states that have about the same kind of usage of diesel oil, and that's Alaska and Maine. And back in 2016-17, we started to look at what Maine was doing over there, where they were implementing heat pumps. Also, previous years, I happened to go back over to Sweden in 2012 visiting my brother, and he had just changed over to heat pump back in 2010 already. And all of Sweden, by 2015 or so, I'd converted over to heat pumps. It was quite amazing to see a whole town with chimneys that didn't put out any smokes at all, and the entire town on heat pumps. Alternate energy harvest time is available. Since we started our solar arrays up in the Arctic, we found that, you know, the heat pump harvest time is the same as the solar harvest time. In the Arctic, we harvest when the energy is there. If it's caribou, berries, energy, or whatever, wind, we go after it as a harvest season. And that's how we started our solar arrays. We realized we could do 3 or 4 or 5 months in the year. So why not do it and see what the impact would be? So the harvest season for heat pumps are the same, of course. Above zero, they have a fairly high, decent COP, but below zero, there's very few heat pumps that work effectively. So implementing heat pumps above zero during the harvest time was what we were aiming for then. So up to 6 months a year, can we use heat pumps? So we looked at different numbers. The COPs to even break even for the diesel displacement was 2.4, 2.4, 2.3, approximately different kind of equipment versus a heat pump. The thing here is that it's also dependent on, of course, that the fuel cost is the same when you look at that COP, and it's not the same. For the households, it's very much more expensive to heat their house than what it is to produce the electricity. So that makes a big difference when we're running the heat pump calculators. Over in Maine, back in 2016-17, we had already seen that they were doing really well, implementing heat pumps everywhere, even down to 27 below in some cases. They are not that different from Alaska, so we knew that what they were doing were looking good. We looked at the advantages: low-cost heat, similar to heat with natural gas or wood, typically half the cost of heating with oil, kerosene, or electric baseboard and propane. To compare heating costs of different heating systems, low-cost air conditioning, of course. There was up in Shungnak, when we put up a heat pump up there, somebody accused me of giving air conditioning to the Eskimos. Well, everybody liked it, actually. The summer gets pretty hot up in Shungnak, so that was an added bonus. And the comfort of having heat pumps and safety, air quality in particular, that gets a whole lot better if you are supplementing with biomass wood. And the filters in the heat pumps can be set just to circulate the air and filter it if the heat pump is not used for anything else. And that way get cleaner air inside the house when people are using wood stoves. And of course, no CO2 emissions if we can go on electricity that is generated by alternate energy then. So we did 13 installations in 2016. There was some advantages to having heat pumps, like a guy up in Guyana decided. He put a little cooling tent outside once he figured out that he was cooling down the outside of his house. At the same time, he put this up when he was hunting and sucked the heat out of the meat and heated his house with it. And got a nice little cooling thing at the same time. Here's some results that are of interest. As you know, of course, as somebody goes out of PCE, the actual cost is going to increase. This ends up being a blended rate. The stove oil here was $9.50 a gallon. The October was heated by equivalent of 11 gallons, but they've used 25 gallons to produce the same amount of kilowatt hours. So of course that has to do with the PCE kicking in between and the inequality between the prices. What happens in the community buildings is the opposite. As I mentioned before, when the electric use go up, the base rate actually go down. So once you start going higher, 590, 939 on community building up our way, the actual cost per kilowatt hour goes down as long as the PCE is available for community buildings if they don't use it up. This, in this case, was $5.50 a gallon. And October was heated by equivalent cost of 33 gallons, but of course, AVAC used 69 gallons to produce the 939 kilowatt hours. So this is just what happens when you deal with the PCE equations in the rural communities. So we looked at untapped PCE, what's available out there. Well, in our region in 2016, we had about $1.1 million sitting there that wasn't used, and our community buildings was about 830,000. So we saw right away that there was enough to add some heat pumps in there, and they could effectively take care of that PCE and keep the rates somewhat decent, not too high for the households. So we decided to experiment. Shungnak household, 35-cent blended rate. This particular calculator was done by Efficiency Maine. And we used that one initially to look at what we were doing. And in this case, the household was saving about $2,000 per year. And it actually turned out fairly close to what the household that we have in Shungnak actually said they saved. They said they saved between $2,300 and $2,400, so a little higher actually than the calculator. The profit would be $23,000, of course, after 15 years. This is with the blended 35-cent rate. So what happens with the full rate? At that time, the rate in Shungnak were 60. So at that point, they still had a saving of $838 a year, but it was getting closer to break even, of course. Still a slight saving due to the high difference between the fuel cost of $8.25 at that time. Now it's $10 up in Shungnak, and the actual cost for AVAC's generation of electricity. The household electric, we just looked at where is it in use. We have the PCE line. 2017 is with the heat pumps, and of course the household uses more during using the heat pump, especially in the shoulder months. However, overall, due to you're looking at 3 years in a row, and 2015, 16, 17, what the household was using, didn't change a whole lot. Between 2016 and 17, adding the heat pump as they were turning off the other appliances didn't change the whole thing. Of course, there's environmental factors in all this. It's not a very accurate, show of what actually is happening, but it doesn't increase the household's electricity use very much when they're switching from one appliance to another. We created the online Alaska calculator together with multiple partners. And in this particular case, you can see a run with it on the latest version of it that was just updated. Let's say we have an average house in Ambler with a Mitsubishi high heat at 38,000 BTU. It shows at $12.36 dollar per gallon fuel, a saving over 14 years at $35,000. And that is, again, because the high difference between the electric fuel rate and the retail rate in Ambler. We looked at the COP curves, and this is off the same calculator right now. So as long as we stay in this range between April and over to November, keep the COP rate above 2.6, it should do fairly well. And that's kind of the indication that we see in these villages. This is the high cost villages, of course. When we go down to other villages, it's gets critical at $5. We added this project into Ambler for a little bit of a change. With the solar powered heat pump, we have 68 households now running in Ambler with solar power, and they know when it gets nice and sunny out, they get this little green mark on it right here. They can run fully on solar, and they don't take anything from the grid for these additional heat pumps. We decided to do it this way as we knew that putting Mitsubishis in 68 households would strain the grid at AVAC to try to see what would happen. So we wanted to make sure that trying this and see how people like it. And it's been very positive. People really like the pumps, and we'll collect data all year on it. This one I'm testing out in a couple of places. I'm just going to go a little bit faster here with my presentation to get to the end. But we have a hydroponic van up in Kotzebue that's powered by that together with solar. And they did really well through January of 2020. To that, we have added, of course, now a Shungnak solar power IPP up in Shungnak, and they now going diesel off almost every day between 4 hours and 7 hours, probably up to 10 when it's available. And during the time in the summer, and for the next 4 or 5 months, they would be a perfect candidate to add Mitsubishi heat pumps to the community. And they'd be running off that alternate energy and offsetting then even more diesel fuel at a high rate during those 6 months when the solar is running. So I know I've gone a little bit over, so I'm going to finish with the last one here. It's not the strongest, of course, that survives. It's the one that is most adaptable to change that survives. So that's what I got.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ingemar. I really appreciate that. There's some great information there, and I look forward to discussing that some more in the Q&A. We're going to move on now to Brandon Shaw. Brandon Shaw is employed by the Inside Passage Electric Cooperative, or IPEC, as they're usually referred to. He's been there since 2014. As the operations manager, he develops plans and oversees IPEC's new and existing power generation facilities and distribution systems. Notably, this includes the construction project management of IPEC's 2 recently completed hydroelectric generation projects in Hoona and in Cake. Brandon is a proven leader in our industry with strong technical skills. And Brandon, it's great for you to be here. I really look forward to hearing what you have to say, and the floor is yours.
Thanks for that introduction, Chris. As Chris stated, I'm the operations manager for Inside Passage Electric, and I'm here to discuss I have a few short slides to discuss what IPEC is doing with heat pumps here in Southeast Alaska. So as stated, IPEC is a member-owned electric cooperative serving the islanded communities here in Southeast Alaska of Angoon, Chilkat Valley, Klukwan, Cake, and Hoona. And after working with Michelle and the ACEP team here recently, IPEC introduced a new heat pump rate to incentivize the use of heat pumps, which went into effect in June of 2021. This rate was designed to kick in after the first 500 kilowatt hours of usage, which typically for residential units or users would be covered by PCE, for those of you that know what the PCE program is here in Alaska. And it's currently limited to residential members only. IPEC has initially limited the numbers of heat pumps in each of our communities until we get a feel for how it affects the peak loads in the wintertime. And as of April 2022, IPEC's members have installed 9 heat pumps in the community of Angoon, 0 in the community of Chilkat Valley, 35 in Hoona, 8 in Cake, and 0 in Klukwan. As you can see, the heat pumps are still very new to IPEC. We're still learning, and we've got much to learn. Just a couple of pictures of projects. The top photo there is a 21-unit condo complex that was completed in Hoona in 2020. All of those units are heated by heat pumps. That was the largest project to date that's been completed. And T&H Housing has been a partner with IPEC, and most of their new homes built in the communities now are being built with heat pumps. To my knowledge, all of them are. And we have an example in the lower left of a unit that was installed in Angoon. A little background, IPEC's generation is currently a mix of run-of-river hydros as well as diesel generation. And due to the islanded nature of IPEC's communities and the variability of our hydro resources, IPEC was initially concerned about being prepared for the peak loads and the demands that the heat pumps would place on the system during the coldest days of the winter, which is also likely when the the hydro production is likely to be very low. During these times, the load is likely to be served nearly 100% by diesel generation, and we do not want to have loading issues on these islanded systems. As a result, IPEC initially placed limits on the installation of the heat pumps at first in order to get some real-time data to determine whether larger generation and/or distribution assets will be needed to handle the loading requirements with further implementation. Below, there's a short graph, kind of just to give an example of what we've seen over the last 4 years in load increase in our communities. Specifically Hoona, as it has the largest adoption rate. We can see in 2018, we were about 780 kW peak loads in the wintertime. That went up in 2019, down a little bit in 2020, but 2021 is up over 900 kW. So we have seen some load increase. We have not reached the limits that we initially set, so we feel there's still room for growth. And we're looking forward to seeing what we can do to incentivize heat pumps and make them work for our communities. That's all I have for slides. So short and sweet.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Brandon. Since we do have a few minutes, there's at least one question that came in here. Do the home in the communities where they have installed heat pumps, and specifically for those homes, do the homes typically maintain a backup fuel source, or how does that work?
Typically, they are maintaining some sort of a backup heating source. In some cases, it's resistive electric heat, which, as we've discussed earlier, is not always the most efficient. There's still a lot of wood heat use in our communities here in Southeast. So combination of wood heat. I'm not aware of anybody that's running backup monitor oil heaters or anything in these new. We're trying to get away from that. At least TNH is kind of pushing to get away from that.
And have most of the heat pumps been installed? Have they pretty much all been in new construction, or have people retrofitted older buildings as well?
There has been some retrofits, again, spearheaded by TNH Housing, but they have retrofitted some.
Okay, and so those older buildings would typically have the wood stoves and that kind of thing that they would use for their backup heat?
Yep.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about how you guys determined how many heat pumps you wanted to start with as kind of that upper level boundary in each village? How is that number determined?
We worked closely with Michelle and ACEP to look at what our peak loads were in each of the communities and what our capacity was for generation in the communities and what kind of wiggle room we had in between. And we set a number. The number is different for each community. It's higher in some, lower in others. But we have a little bit of we have a ways to go before we reach our peak in any of the communities. So we're looking forward to bringing more heat pumps on.
Okay. And there's a question here. Have you guys started to think maybe about using heat pumps as part of a demand response strategy or something like that when you have more hydro available?
We have thought about it, and that's typically in the shoulder seasons in the spring and fall. Obviously, in the wintertime, we don't have huge hydro resources as we're run-of-river hydro.
Okay.
But it is something that we have looked at and considered, and we're looking at the technology that will allow us to do that.
Sure. And Mark was wondering if you can describe how the heat pump rate works a little bit. Is there a separate meter on the heat pump, or is it, is it a time of use rate, or is it just based upon total kilowatt hours usage, then subtracting total kilowatt hours usage over the 500 kilowatt hours PCE number?
It is. It's based on the total kilowatt hour usage. So we're using just one meter. There's not a separate meter for the heat pump. And essentially, once the residential home meets that 500 kilowatt hour threshold, from there above or thereon, everything is at the heat pump rate. And that only applies to homes that have the heat pumps installed. And there's an application process that needs to happen in order for that rate to apply.
Okay. And so if the homes have a heat pump installed, there's really no way of differentiating the energy usage from the heat pump to the other energy that's used in the home. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. Not currently with the current technology that we're using.
Sure. Okay. And as far as the installations, these things are being installed all over your communities, which are obviously pretty spread out. Is there primarily one installer who's doing those installations, or how is that working?
Yeah, primarily it's TNH housing contractors.
And so they, Clinket Haida Housing has someone that's trained in the installations, and they do all that in-house, or do they contract that?
I don't want to speak to that for sure. I believe it's in-house, but that's I'm not 100% sure.
Perfect. Wonderful. And can you speak a little bit about how the heat pump rate over the 500 kilowatt hours compares to the PCE subsidized rate?
It is, the PCE rate, or the rate that the members pay after PCE is applied, varies, but it's around that 24, 25 cents a kilowatt hour. And right now the heat pump rate is 29.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's a little bit more than the PC that the residents would pay. They were just paying the PCE rate, but it is significantly less than our market rate.
And what's your market rate right now?
It's got to be close to 58, 56 cents.
Okay.
8 cents. It varies with the cost of fuel, obviously. So, but we're right up near 58 cents.
Okay.
So,
and I'm sure that rate is probably going up, unfortunately, with every barge that delivers fuel right now, as Ingemar just alluded to. Do you guys have you attempted to try to estimate how much diesel is being displaced with your heat pump program?
we haven't yet. I know we ran some initial numbers with ACEP, but I don't have those numbers right off the top of my head or handy. And based on implementation, I don't have that.
Okay, well, this is really exciting. I know this is just the first winter of the program, so undoubtedly, as this program continues into the future, we'll get more data, and it'll be very interesting to track this and to see how the program evolves. In some ways, it makes me think a little bit of the net metering program that exists on the Railbelt, where it started as a pilot program, and as that's continued, it's kind of evolved through time, and some of the net metering caps have been raised and that kind of stuff. So it'll be very interesting to see how this evolves in IPEC. I really appreciate your presentation, and we can have some more Q&A at the end here. But I think we're going to move on. Our next presenter, I'm very excited to say, is Bob Deering. Bob completed a 32-year career with multiple federal agencies. He is currently working as an environmental engineer in renewable energy and energy efficiency leadership roles. He's working with Alaska Heat Smart in Juneau, Alaska, helping them build their programs and capabilities dedicated to transitioning Juneau to clean energy heating on a community scale. The floor is yours, Bob. Take it away.
Thanks, Chris.
Your slide looks great.
Thank you, Chris. And hey, congrats to your event supporters for herding all of us presenter cats. She's doing a great job. Like Chris said, I'm Bob Deering, work for a small nonprofit in Juneau. Our work is focused on Juneau. Our supporting partners are the City and Borough of Juneau, AEL&P, our local electric utility. Renewable Juneau is kind of the umbrella nonprofit that we work with. I'm just going to jump into this. Let me throw some random numbers on the screen. I don't have to read them to you. That's what average yearly residential heating looks like in Juneau for the average house in Juneau. And these are the numbers that we're trying to drive down with our work. And like Chris said, we're trying to transform residential heating at a community scale. We're not a research organization. We're not trying to be on the bleeding edge of any technology. Our real focus is trying to do standard heat pump technology at the greatest number of houses in Juneau that we can. Little bit about Juneau. Looks like my lettering, my words are covered up by our video. The population here is about 32,000, except when the cruise ships are in, then it's about 52,000. We're the capital of Alaska. Juneau's not accessible by the road system. You can fly in here, you can take water. Don't try driving, that won't help. We're 100% hydropower, and we're really blessed with that. Our electric utility rate's about 12 cents a kilowatt hour in the winter, and we've got a lot of capacity for growth. So as we electrify Juneau, our utility can keep up with things. We do not have natural gas. We don't have coal. We're looking at mostly heating oil and electricity, some wood heating. We're considered the northern, again, I can't read my lettering. We're considered Northern Pacific climate. Temperatures are in the 20s to 30s, typically in the winter. So we're really mild by other Alaska standards. Temperatures seldom fall below 9 degrees. 9 degrees Fahrenheit for the engineers and the tech weenies out there is the 1% temperature. So 99% of the time, our temperatures are above 9 degrees Fahrenheit. 1% of the time, they drop below that. To put it in a little context, Fairbanks design temperature is minus 40 degrees. So 1% of the time, they're below minus 40. We people here in Juneau can't imagine who's crazy enough to live up in Fairbanks in those temperatures. In Juneau, we're a wet place. Our rainfall we measure it in feet. We get about 5 feet of rain a year. And my friends up in Fairbanks can't imagine who's crazy enough to live in a wet place like this. So to each their own. Alaska's a big place. Our area of focus is pretty much on residential heating, single family housing. Mostly we're talking about existing stock, and we're retrofitting houses. There's a lot of heat pumps going into new housing. That's not really the focus of Alaska Heat Smart. We're working with folks to retrofit their houses. So far, we've worked with about 500 households in Juneau. Profile on our houses, yeah, most of them are built before 1990. A big boom in houses when the Alaska pipeline came in and all that money came into Juneau. What we're looking at is about 10,000 units, and that's single family housing. That's anything from mobile homes, some townhouses and condos are included in that number. The efficiency in Juneau houses is not generally that great. New houses with new building standards, much better. And we can see that in the data as we look at energy usage. But overall, it's pretty moderate. The old houses in Juneau, the historic ones that were built in 1915, unless they've had a bunch of retrofit work on energy efficiency, their leaky houses probably don't have any insulation. They really eat the energy. It's mostly heating oil, like I mentioned earlier, hydronic boilers or forced air furnaces. Some people are putting in little Toyo stoves too, which are unit heaters. I'm assuming most people are familiar with. About 10% of the heating in Juneau right now is done with electric resistance. And there's more houses that have electric baseboard in them, but a lot of people have put in little Toyo stoves, assuming that oil heat is cheaper than electric heat. Today's oil prices have really skyrocketed. It's about $4.60 a gallon currently in Juneau, which is pretty moderate compared to what Ingemar was talking about. 2 years ago, we were seeing $2.40 a gallon. So, prices have pretty much doubled in Juneau. Oil heating is about 20% more expensive than electric baseboard now. So I don't know if folks have figured it out. The guys running their Toyos, they should turn them off and turn on their electric baseboard. The heat pumps we're looking at, again, it's not cutting edge technology. This is straightforward standard technology you can buy off the shelf pretty much. These are ductless heat pumps, the outdoor units, the business end of things with the compressor and the heat exchange with the ambient air. The indoor units typically are wall mounted units like shown in the photo. There's some other indoor unit types as well, but the wall mounted are the most common. These units are compatible with our climate. They're generally rated down to 10 or 15 below zero, and we rarely reach that point. But if we're going to hit 10 or 15 below zero, the heat pumps aren't putting out a lot of heat. So typically we need to have a supplemental backup heating system in these houses as well. Outputs are 9,000 to 36,000 BTUs, and that ranges pretty closely to what the heating usage is in most Juneau houses. Some houses are a bit above that, but this is a big chunk of the heating demand in most houses. What we generally find is that single head heat pumps are the biggest bang for the buck for your installation costs, but some houses, it's appropriate to put in multi-head systems or ducted systems. What our function is in this process is we're really consultants. We're providing consultation services to homeowners. Heat pumps are kind of a black box for a lot of people. They don't understand how the technology works. They don't understand the appropriate utilization in their homes. When you buy a car, you know what a car does. It's got four wheels in it, and you get in, you drive it. With a heat pump, it's not quite as clear for people, but yet it's a pretty substantial investment. You're looking at anything from $7,000–8,000 to maybe over $20,000. What we do is, number one, folks apply for a consultation or assessment from us. They get on our website, they do an application, they provide their energy usage history. How much oil have you burned? Are you burning wood? That kind of information. They give us information on their houses as well. AEL&P provides us with the electric use history in a spreadsheet, so that takes that burden off the homeowner. We do an individual site visit to the houses. We visit with the folks, we look around their house, we talk to them. And I noted COVID in the on my notes there. That was a little wrinkle we had to deal with, especially during the height of COVID. We were doing some of our site visits remotely. Much tougher to do without seeing the floor plan of the house. Typically now we require everybody wears a mask when we visit, and we ask the homeowners to do the same thing. Once we get all the data from the houses, we take that back, we run some analysis on that. We've got a model that we've developed. And I want to pause and do a big shout out to Alan Mitchell of Analysis North. He's got a great online heat pump model that you can plug in your information into and get the economics results back from that. Alan was very helpful to us in developing our model, and we shamelessly plagiarized what he did. So again, thanks to Alan Mitchell. Once we've done our analysis, and we're generally mostly getting financial information, CO2 usage or CO2 reductions, and a few other technical points about the houses. We generate a recommendations report that we send to the homeowner. And then after they get quotes from installers, once they get those quotes, they can come back to us with those quotes and ask us to help them evaluate the quotes. Installers will oftentimes give different quotes for different systems in different formats, and it's hard for homeowners to do an apples to apples comparison of what they're getting back. One of the main questions we ask is, why are you doing this? Why do you want a heat pump? And we've got a list here of the kinds of things that are motivating folks. Reducing costs, almost always. A lot of people want to reduce fossil fuel usage if they're heating their home with oil. And maybe their system is at its end, and they've got to make some decisions on what their heating system is going to look like. You can see the rest of my list: air conditioning and cooling for those 3 glorious days in Juneau when it's 75 degrees. People want to cool their houses back down to Juneau temperatures. I had a note in there eliminating oil spill risk and liability. Sometimes folks will have a rusty old fuel oil tank sitting right next to a water body or sitting on the hill above their neighbor's property. If your tank leaks onto a neighbor's property, the cost for heating your house pales in comparison to doing an oil spill cleanup. Occasionally we run into older folks that just the burden of collecting firewood and hauling firewood inside is becoming untenable. It's not uncommon for the guy who goes out and cuts his own firewood for his wife to step in and say, no more, you can't come hobbling into the house anymore, get a heat pump. Once we do the site visit, what we're looking at is the floor plan. We get a tour of their floor plan to get a sense of how heat is going to move throughout the house from a heat pump. We look at their existing heating systems. We look at their electrical systems as well. And probably most importantly is we have a conversation one-on-one with these folks, and we talk about those goals. We educate them about heat pumps, kind of take some of that black box-ness out of the equation. We talk about different options that we might have. We answer a lot of the questions that folks are going to have, and we help guide them through the next steps for getting quotes and installing heat pumps. When we do the analysis, we're taking that energy history the folks provided, the electricity information we got from the utility. We're plugging in some site observations that we gathered while we were visiting those folks. We can generate multiple different scenarios. If you put a single head heat pump in, if you put a multi-head heat pump in, what do the costs look like? What are the benefits going to look like for you? What are the capital expenses? that would take. We, again, run this through the model that I talked about earlier. And the outputs, again, we're getting what their annual savings would be. What would be the simple payback? How many years would it take for this heat pump to pay for itself with the savings? And we also put out CO2 reduction. A lot of the common obstacles we run into, one is they're expensive. Like I mentioned, a system can be $6,000, $7,000, can be $20,000. That's a big expense for folks. Prices have definitely gone up in the last 6 months with supply constraints, workforce constraints as well. We have helped set up a financing program, by the way, with one of the local credit unions, and we point people towards that. If they go in with a certificate that we've generated from our assessments, the credit union is pretty much is ready to go on giving them very, very, I think it's 4% financing. So it's very attractive. Some houses have floor plan constraints. A house that is chopped up into a lot of really small rooms, it's difficult to do a cost-effective heat pump system. A single head heat pump system is going to be difficult for that heat to get transferred throughout the house. You're going to end up having to do a more expensive system. Generally, the legacy system that you have, you're going to want to keep that in place if it's still viable for those times when temperatures are too low for the heat pump to function, or to heat part of the house. And oftentimes a hybrid system makes the most sense, where you're going to heat the main living areas of the house that you keep the warmest with the heat pump, and then those peripheral areas where you're keeping that back bedroom cool. Just use the existing system because you're not spending that much money to keep those areas cool. But there's a lot of intricacies in making that legacy system integrate with the heat pump intelligently. That oftentimes is kind of the secret sauce of what we're working on. House electrical systems can be a barrier too. Breaker panels can be completely full. A heat pump requires a 240 volt circuit. Some of the panels just don't physically have space for that. So they would require a sub panel or a larger panel to be installed. Now you've just increased the cost of your system. Some of the really old houses in Juneau, the electric service coming in from the utility was very marginal by today's standards. So you might even have to upgrade the electric service out to the utility. That's more cost. Occasionally, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of houses in Juneau aren't that efficient. And we'll recommend, hey, before you even think about a heat pump, look at some efficiency measures. Go out and get an official energy audit. Figure out what other things you can do before you worry about doing a heat pump. And then occasionally you run into aesthetics. Somebody doesn't want, an appliance hanging on the wall in their very well decorated living room. And so there's oftentimes that can be a deal breaker occasionally.
Hey, Bob, just a quick time check. You got about 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Holy cow. Okay. You can see the numbers that we're jumping to. If we do go through our process, what we're seeing on average is a 46% reduction in costs. You can see the cost per square foot annually is about cut in half, dramatically reducing the amount of heating oil, and likewise with the CO2. Let's see if I can. Some of the challenge we run into our model, validating our model. A lot of this is still based on a lot of assumptions. We're just starting to go back to houses that have installed heat pumps that we can use that data to validate and see how our model is actually performing. So far, the few validations we've looked at, that model is working really well. We're less than 10% off. I don't believe that's going to be the case for much longer. Workforce, equipment, supply chain, all those are challenges for us. And just really quickly, our wish list, if we had a magic wand, defrost impacts in Juneau with our wet environment, we'd like to understand the impacts on efficiency better. You can see that little graph shows every spike is where our heat pump had to go through a defrost cycle. What is that doing to the COP on our heat pumps? We're hoping ACEP and cold climate housing are going to be able to evaluate that. Domestic hot water with heat pumps, we'd like to see better systems out there. We really would love to see a heat pump that can drop into a hydronic boiler replacement. That's high temperature hot water. And I think I'll jump through the rest of these for the sake of time, but we have a number of spin-off activities that have come from our efforts that we're really excited about. There we go. Andy Romanoff is our executive director, by the way. Thanks, Chris.
That was wonderful. Thanks, Bob. And I really look forward to maybe touching on some of those final things in the Q&A if we have time. We will move on to our final presenter for this panel, and it's someone everybody knows very well already. And I think the fact that she's presenting on this panel also speaks to her talents as a researcher. Michelle Wilbur is a research engineer, and she's my colleague here at ACEP. She leads the Beneficial and Equitable Electrification Initiative. She has a bachelor's in astronomy from Caltech and a master's in mechanical engineering from UAA. She grew up in Alaska, and she says that she's thrilled to do work that she hopes that will continue to make Alaska a great place. And she's here to talk to us about electric vehicles. Take it away, Michelle.
Well, switching over to a presenter hat, this is the early adopter panel, not the researcher panel, but looking at what we know about electric vehicles in Alaska. I thought I would present on what we are compiling here at ACEP, because it really is, we are really looking at the early adopters for electric vehicles in the state and trying to capture that information, anecdotal and data-wise and everything. So there's a couple of pioneers on my opening screen. One is my fearless leader, Erin Whitney, the Anchorage Solar Team leader, who really set us off in this direction with questions about electric vehicles and what people's concerns and hopes were in the state and what their experiences around early adoption were. And then she is driving at the moment of this picture, the Kotzebue Electric Nissan Leaf full electric, battery electric vehicle, which is, a really groundbreaking thing that Kotzebue Electric brought this vehicle to Kotzebue in 2018, I believe. So definitely an early adopter. And I'd like to thank our funders. We have National Science Foundation navigating the new Arctic funding for planning activities around electric vehicles in rural Alaska. We have Office of Naval Research funding that helps fund a lot of these efforts. And we work really closely with other engineers in UAA and UAF, and also with Institute of Social and Economic Research researchers at UAA, Jen Schmidt especially. So thank you everybody that's helped with this work. So ACEP is, our mission involves fostering development of practical, innovative, cost-effective energy solutions for Alaska and beyond. So one of our big questions is, are electric vehicles practical, innovative, cost-effective solutions? And so a lot of what we're trying to do with our Beneficial and Equitable Electrification Group is look into that, both for electric heating and electric transportation. And it's a really great group of researchers that come together and discuss these projects and research opportunities. And I'm very happy to be part of this team. So as I mentioned, we do have a National Science Foundation funding right now to look at electric vehicles in rural Alaska for the acronym of VITA. We call it Electric Vehicles in the Arctic. And in that case, we're trying to figure out what folks' perceived barriers to adoption might be in rural communities where there aren't connected road systems, where there aren't dealerships and mechanics ready to work on electric vehicles, where there's small isolated microgrids that might be burning diesel to make electricity. So we're looking at what electric vehicles might mean in those communities. Like I said, Kotzebue has an electric vehicle, but in general, they're not on the cutting edge of early adoption. And so what are the things that might stand in the way? What mechanisms might facilitate adoption, if that makes sense? And what might the best uses of electric vehicles be in those situations? Is an electric snow machine a good idea? Or is that leading you into the danger zone hundreds of miles from your community on the tundra? So that's one of the things we're looking into. And in that case, it's really important to keep in mind what electric vehicles are on the market right now, because that really, that's what people have to choose from. And so, we know that there's a number of electric passenger cars, but the global market for electric vehicles, and in the US, of course, is expanding rapidly. And so that now there's an electric snow machine on the market. One remains to be seen if it's appropriate for our uses up here. There are some electric four-wheelers. Again, are they appropriate and do they work well in our conditions? And, trucks and other vehicles are coming or are starting to be out now. And so we're interested in examining all of those for appropriateness. One of the questions people have up here a lot is how do you keep them charged up? It's very clear how you fuel your vehicle. And so there's different levels of chargers. And in many of our communities with limited road systems, sort of low-level chargers that plug into a wall plug, a 120 volt, or like a dryer wall plug equivalent, like a 240 volt plug, work just fine and charge your vehicle in a number of hours, especially with limited use. The large level 3 special fast chargers that they're installing in California. This is my stepfather goofing around with a big heavy cable to charge his electric vehicle in California. Those are appropriate they're appropriate in many conditions. Any place people need to charge up quickly, like taxi cabs might need to in Bethel in the middle of their day, but on the road system, there are applications there. I won't go into that too deeply. One of the big questions that comes up is how well these vehicles work in winter. And this is really where the early adopters in the state come in, because people have been adopting these in cold places, electric cars. There's a number of battery electric vehicles in Fairbanks that gets quite cold there in the interior. There's the Kotzebue electric Leaf that we have information on. There's a school bus in Tok. So we can collect data, and it does seem that the majority of these vehicles are running well all through the winter. They might need to stay plugged in or be parked somewhere warm to keep them ready to go. It may be that the 12 volt starter battery, keeping that warm and not, in the same way that you would need to in a gas vehicle, may be one of the more important things, because the battery that keeps the vehicle moving generally has a system to keep it at a happy temperature when it's not in use, as long as it has a source of power as the battery is running down. So as far as being, stranded in the cold, as long as you have a place to plug in or a warm place to park, and we realize that a warm place to park is a luxury that many Alaskans don't have, then you can keep them running even at -40 Fahrenheit and below. Another big question is, especially if you're on a diesel microgrid, are they really saving fuel? And if you just do the math, if a diesel generator is using a gallon of diesel to create somewhere between 13 or 15 kilowatt hours of power, and you look at the electric battery car number of miles it can go in a kilowatt hour, and that rating is usually for a summer use, where they're using more electricity in the winter to keep the battery warm and to keep people inside the car warm, then you're looking at a pretty good fuel efficiency, kind of at the peak, somewhere around 54 miles per gallon, and most cars in communities are not getting that. In the winter, they need, like I said, to use a lot more electricity to stay warm, so that's dropping. And this 29 miles per gallon is actually pretty, that's the high end, because they're also using some power while they're parked, just like a gas vehicle might need to be idled or plugged in while it's parked and use additional energy. But again, it's not a horrible thing, is some might think trying to change that diesel into electricity and then back into moving a car again. Whether they save money or save climate emissions really depends on their use, and we have created a calculator that you can access at the site on this, listed on this slide, to help you figure out if they might work well in your situation, how far you have to drive in the community you live in Alaska and everything. The calculator is a little bit of an energy nerd calculator. It does ask for some information you might not know. You can choose defaults there. We've gone through some examples for the communities on our list, And if somebody is really efficient with their gas car that they're comparing it to, and they don't idle it very much when it's cold, they just get it warmed up quickly and go and keep it plugged in for a few hours before using it when it's cold, then really actually it turns out to kind of be a wash. You're not really saving the environment or saving money with an electric vehicle. However, there are a lot of people that don't use a timer on their block heater and idle the car a lot to keep it warm when it's cold or to keep it running. And in those cases, it's actually, you're saving a lot of money in greenhouse gas emissions with the EV that's pretty much in the same, being used the same way in both cases, plugged in a lot when it's not being used to keep it warm and ready to go. So that usage can really matter. The back end of the calculator is all the data we've been crowdsourcing or gathering from people who are willing to share their data with us that have vehicles in Alaska. And so we've just fit a linear trend to the energy it takes to drive them depending on temperature, which seems to be pretty linear between -40 Celsius or Fahrenheit and, summer temperatures. And then we also, this plot here is the parked energy use, trying to separate that out from the driving energy use. So if you have a fully charged vehicle and you park it overnight, then how much is it going to use? And in that case, that data is a little harder to tease out. And so we kind of have a couple of possible different fits for it, depending on what we keep in. It looks different for different vehicles. And using a year's worth of data from my own vehicle, a Chevy Bolt in Anchorage, which doesn't get as cold as the vehicles are seen in Fairbanks, but using that year's worth of data, it looks like we maybe used a little bit of a generous amount of energy, or we were generous in letting it not use very much energy in the calculator when it's parked, but we're still trying to figure that out. So that's kind of a research thing to continue to look at different vehicles and analyze that. We're also looking at big vehicles. So MOA has a box truck and Toke has a bus. And yes, I realize I'm out of time, so I'll wrap up very quickly here. But those larger vehicles, of course, are using even more energy to drive, especially like the bus has to keep the whole inside of the bus warm enough for the kids, and it's using electricity to do so. It doesn't have a separate propane or fuel heater in it. And so that one is definitely has a steeper trend of using more energy as it gets colder out, but it's still able to drive all season long. Both of these vehicles do park in a heated garage or space, and that's because the diesel vehicles that they're replacing also need that to continue to operate, or they have other reasons. It isn't just for the EV. So they're able to take advantage of parking in a warm place and then just driving in the cold. But they're working fine. We're still gathering information. So we have a bunch more crowdsourced data to analyze and verify and compare. And we have some interns this summer to look at it. So we're very excited to continue to tease out what we are learning from these early adopters, and especially as the different vehicle types come out, and what that means as far as affordability and applicability in different situations in Alaska. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Michelle. That was great. That was a really great overview of a lot of the work that you've been very busy on. So now we are going to bring everybody back onto the screen here. And we have a number of questions that have been rolling in. So I'm going to try to go through some of those. For folks, if you do have questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat, and I will bring them up to the panelists. And if the panelists are not able to get to every question, they will do their best to respond in the chat for things that they're not able to answer verbally. I'm going to start us off with a question, since it always seems like the challenge with the new technology is really about training the people. I'm wondering if each of you would talk about who your typical early adopter is in the projects that you've been involved with, and what the biggest challenge is as far as communicating the new technology and training the people on using that technology. And Ingemar, since you're beside me on the screen, I'd invite you to go first.
Oh, okay, thank you. I would say that, people generally out in the villages, they're excited about the new heat pumps and see how they work and engage with them almost immediately, similar to when we first adopted Toyo stoves. It's similar, and it start figuring out how they work, when they can be worked, and so on and so forth. I don't see anything specifically different than that.
Okay. Brandon?
Well, our typical users are families, small homes in our communities. They're still very, very new to us, only with a year or two of information or users. But the big thing that we've noticed with early adopters is there's been a hesitancy to use them for fear of driving up their electric bill. Even with the heat pump rate, our analysis determined that there is a savings to the members using a heat pump versus fuel oil at the cost of fuel oil in the villages. But there still has been a little bit of a struggle to get people to actually use them. I think they tend to still use a lot of wood stoves where they can and stuff like that. So, but it's any new technology, it's going to take a little bit of time and for people to adopt it and feel comfortable. Those that have embraced it and have been using them have been very happy with them. The indoor air quality is a lot better. Maintenance is significantly less than your typical Toyo stove or packing around wood and keeping your wood stove going. So,
Great. Bob, you want to share some of your experiences?
I guess I think our observation is that the earliest adopters on this are folks at the higher end of the income spectrum. Heat pumps are a big investment. They're the guys that can afford to throw out 10 grand a little more quickly than somebody, whose annual income is only $50,000. Folks that are looking at having to change out their heating system, they're starting to think about heating systems. So heat pumps start to come to mind. But with the doubling of heating oil costs in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of interest in heat pumps. It's growing rapidly.
Interesting. And Michelle, what's your observation is that for the early EV adopters that you've seen?
Yeah, certainly there's the folks that have the money to buy a new Tesla, not necessarily the cheap version. Then there's the people getting used Leafs into Juno at kind of a discount that are just your average person. I would say in general, it's that profile of an early adopter that is willing to take the risk on a new technology that hasn't necessarily been proven, has at least enough disposable income to be able to take that risk, even if they're finding a good priced used car, or know somebody who took the risk before them and has some idea that things will work well, and is interested in, they're either a science data type nerd that really wants to see how they work out and how that energy works, or they're a tech person who likes the newest shiny thing, or they're interested in their climate impact. There's probably, I don't know, I don't mean to stereotype or characterize, but there's some general characteristics sometimes.
Michelle, what I'm hearing you say is these were probably also the first people to get iPhones back in the day.
Yeah, possibly. Although it took me a lot less. Well, I didn't study iPhones. I wasn't sure that I would be a good candidate for an electric vehicle because I don't drive very much. So I thought the thing would use a lot of energy keeping its battery warm all winter. But we ended up, after looking at the data and looking at our round trip for my husband to drive to work, we're like, hey, it looks like this will work out. So we found a cheap used Bolt last year, and it seems to work fine. I was a iPhone, I put off smartphones as long as I possibly could.
Great.
Hey, Chris, if I can
go ahead.
One more thing, and I didn't mention in Juneau, I think we're past the early adopter phase. We probably have 1,000, maybe 2,000 heat pumps already, and they're proven. We're in full go at this point.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. So you guys have kind of passed that bottom of that curve, and now you're starting to really speed up. And I'm sure the current price of oil will probably even make that curve a little bit steeper.
Yep.
In Bob's presentation, he really talked about being interested in. Ingemar, you just raised your hand. Go ahead. You're muted.
Just a quick note, to what Efficiency Maine and the state of Maine did over there. State incentive programs for adoption worked very well over there. as far as people adopting it generally. And we should consider that for both solar arrays and heat pumps for Alaska.
Good, thanks for that. So in Bob's presentation at the end there, he talked about being really interested in getting some more research on the defrost cycling of heat pumps. And I was curious, especially for Ingemar and Brandon, is there anything in particular that you would like to see additional research on as part of your heat pump installations?
Well, the heat pumps that are out there that we need to do more research on is the ones that are air to hot water for sure. The other ones, we have certain collaborations with UAF up our way on the effectiveness of them. The defrost cycle is definitely there. It's an issue. And the more wet an environment is, the more that's going to affect the heat pumps, right? I'm not sure we can do much more about that, but how to install them. We learned a lot of installing the combined solar ones, of course, and that is that the heat pumps should generally be put on the south side of the house where it's sunny, not on the north side where the wind blows. So you can gain as much energy efficiency as you can out of the pump, but maybe preheaters in some cases could be something to think about. I've seen some interesting installations from Canada.
Brandon, you have any thoughts?
I guess, as I alluded to in my presentation, our biggest concern at IPEC has been being able to serve the load with a large number of these being adopted. So, and since we are in Southeast Alaska and it is very wet here, and the thaw cycle is an issue, that's what put the biggest load on our system. I would agree that more information about that would be helpful for us moving forward.
Great. There's a question here specifically for Bob, although others are welcome to chime in as well. Bob, how are you validating your model? Assuming you're not actually measuring the COP of the heat pumps and that kind of thing. How are you going about that?
We're going back to places that we assessed initially and houses that have now installed heat pumps. We started about 2 years ago. So we're starting to see some houses that actually installed heat pumps after we assessed them and are starting to get a heating season's worth of data. So now we're going back to that data. And that's part of the deal we have with folks is we'll come do this assessment. It costs you nothing, but you have to give us information after the fact. And then we're looking to see, is there real world results resemble what we predicted they would be. And so far, and we haven't done many, we've done maybe half a dozen, and the results have been close, but that's a small sample number.
Okay. And Bob, how many people do you think go through Alaska Heat Smart versus just calling up an installer?
In this time frame, we've done about 500 people. I wish I knew that better. I would guess that maybe the word is really out on Heat Smart now, and people are understanding the value we add. Maybe we do, I'm just ballparking, maybe a third of the people that are looking at heat pumps come to us at this point, but I wish I knew better.
And have you guys considered expanding beyond Juneau, specifically maybe to other areas in Alaska or to other areas in Southeast?
Yeah, there's been a little bit of discussion about it. We're, of course, we're a very small, our capacity is very limited. We're a small nonprofit. Occasionally we'll reach out. We'll have somebody reach out from other locations. Like I've got one on the list from Cordova right now, or Kodiak, or Skagway, asking the same kinds of questions. And to an extent, without major changes to our model, we can help them with that. And what we find is if your electricity costs are above, say, 20 cents a kilowatt hour, the economics just become a lot more difficult. That's all changed. Heating oil prices are a lot higher too, so maybe the economics work better for remote communities.
There's a lot of questions coming in here specifically to Michelle, and it looks like Michelle is answering a number of them in the chat. But maybe Michelle, you could just kind of speak about, your work for passenger vehicles versus larger vehicles, and how you've gone about that, and kind of what the status of that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, there's a lot of questions about, have you considered this, or would you investigate this? And absolutely, as time allows, we're certainly interested in looking at lots of different options for, different technologies and transportation. And I will say we've made sort of a group decision, I guess, that beneficial electrification, or the beneficial and equitable electrification group, is looking at electrification. And so while there's electricity to hydrogen to vehicle, we're not really looking deeply into that right now. But one of the other things is we are a sort of a practical group of people that often uses off-the-shelf technology to study or looks at what people have on the road and are willing to either share data with us, or we enter into a grant for a pilot project and as the data analyst for that grant. And so we kind of get the data to analyze and get those analysis products and modeling done as we can with our partners. And so that means the fact that there are a lot of people with passenger electric vehicles on the road, battery electric vehicles, and we have a little bit of hybrid data, but that's harder to tease out stuff. And we are, like I said, working with the municipality of Anchorage, who has a box truck and is hoping to get a garbage truck, and Toke, that has an electric school bus, and looking at that data. So continually happy to work with partners to analyze the data coming from other vehicles and how those work in our conditions.
Okay. And with that, I think we are at the end of our time. So again, there's still some additional comments and questions coming in the chat, and I would invite our panelists to go ahead and answer those. Thank you all so much for being willing to present. I think there was some really great information that came out here, and I look forward to this really laying the foundation for more of the things that we discuss throughout this workshop over the next day and a half. So with that, Michelle, I'm going to turn it back to you.
So we are going to start back up again with an engagement poll. So we hope you enjoyed this morning's program so far and got a chance to do whatever you needed to do during the break. So let's start with our activity. As a reminder, all you need to do is type in pollev.com/TOTTAK216 or text TOTTAK216 to 22333 to participate. So that's all in the chat as well, since might be hard to get it from me reading it off. The link to the poll, or they're going to pop the question up on the screen now. And so the question is, what sector do you represent relative to beneficial and equitable electrification opportunities in Alaska? So yeah, people are leading off with things. So are you in industry, a researcher, an early adopter, however you want to respond to that. And the word cloud is forming, and so far the research is winning, strangely. But there's a lot of other sectors coming up. So we've got a bunch of engineers. We've got folks in various energy fields like oil and gas or hydroelectric. We've got nonprofit and consultants. We've got industry, and some folks putting the word Alaska in there, which is great since we are in Alaska. And probably not surprisingly, because of the nature of this this conference and the fact that ACEP is paid on, we've got a big research in the middle with also now a bunch of utility folks. So thank you very much for participating in the poll. So now we're excited to continue on and dive into our second session. Panel 2 is going to include 5 presentations. That's a lot of presentations in an hour and 20 minutes. So each of the presentations will include a little bit of time if the presenter leaves it for questions for each speaker. Otherwise, they will attend to questions in the chat if there isn't a chance to address those directly. So we're very excited to share with you this cutting edge research panel. So in this instance, we as the research community in Alaska have reached out to the research community with the national labs and other universities to try to learn what is going on, what are we learning, what is at the forefront of research and beneficial electrification that we can learn from up here and maybe incorporate into some of our work moving forward, all of us in this sector in Alaska. So as a reminder, during the session, questions can be submitted via the chat box. They'll be addressed during Q&A either verbally, or folks can get on and answer questions in the chat box. So please join me in welcoming our next moderator, who will be introducing our panel to participants. Tom Marsick is a very amazing and busy person who has joint appointments with UAF Bristol Bay campus, with ACEP, with Cold Climate Housing Research Center, CCHRC, which is with NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab. So he holds many hats. I first heard of Tom when he had the tightest house in the world. He built a very energy efficient home in Dillingham that had the tightest envelope, the least air leakage of any house in the world, which is just amazing. And I actually remember coming up to him at a conference when he had no idea who I was, and I wanted all kinds of details on it because it was just such a feat. So please join me in welcoming Associate Professor of Sustainable Energy for the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Tom Marsick.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for that kind introduction. And likewise, it has been just really great to be working with you. And I want to say thank you to everybody involved in this workshop. It's just such an exciting workshop that brings us a little bit closer to the solutions to our energy issues. So in the first panel today, we learned about some of the needs in our communities. And now in the second panel, we are going to talk about the cutting edge research that helps us address some of those needs. And I'm going to kick off the panel with just a very quick overview of air-to-air heat pump research currently happening at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, which now is a part of the National Renewable Energy Lab. Then Robin Garber-Slaad is going to talk about ground source heat pump research at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, and also some additional aspects related to space heating electrification. Then Armando Casillas is going to talk about heating and cooling research at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. After that, Ron Domitrovic is going to talk about end-use research at the Electric Power Research Institute with focus on heat pumps. And then we are going to pivot away from heating and cooling and towards transportation. And Anadip Meadam is going to talk about electric vehicle charging research at the Idaho National Lab. And we are going to close the session with Adam Davis, who is going to talk about the UC Davis electric vehicle adoption tool. So I'm just going to jump right into it. And like I said, I just want to give a very quick overview of what's currently happening at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center with respect to research into cold climate air-to-air heat pumps. And I want to highlight three projects. So the first project I want to highlight is one that's utilizing this cold chamber that we have here at CCHRC. And we are using it to study the performance of ductless municipal heat pumps, and especially are focusing on how they behave at different levels of thermal loading, because this is something we don't understand very well yet. And it's important to know because it guides things like how do we want to be sizing heat pumps in cold climates. The second project I want to highlight is a collaboration between the National Renewable Energy Lab and the Oak Ridge National Lab. So here at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, we are doing basically field validation of a cold climate heat pump prototype developed by the Oak Ridge National Lab. So we are taking advantage of the cold climate conditions here in Fairbanks, Alaska, to evaluate the performance of this heat pump prototype. And the third project I want to highlight is a project in which we are helping Alaska Heat Smart implement the Thermalize Juneau campaign. It's a campaign that's taking advantage of the economies of scale to implement heat pumps and other energy efficiency measures. And along the way, we are studying the impact. So this was just a very quick overview for those of you who were wondering what's happening at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center with respect to air-to-air heat pumps. I'm gonna skip questions because I really want to make sure we have enough time for our speakers. We have a really exciting panel lined up, and feel free to put in questions into the chat. I'm hoping we can have a little discussion after each presentation if time allows. And with that, it's my real pleasure to introduce Robin Garber Slaad, who is a research engineer and has been at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center since 2009. Her background is in mechanical and cold climate engineering. Today, her focus is on helping to develop energy efficient housing for Alaskans. Toward that end, she helps to create and test high efficiency building envelopes for cold climates. Robin also works on improving heating and ventilation systems in cold climates. Her most recent work has been on cold climate heat pumps and energy recovery ventilators in the subarctic. Welcome, Robin, and the floor is all yours.
Well, good morning. I think it's still morning. This is actually, I am really pleased with this, this presentation, and everything that I've seen so far today has really been wonderful. And I'm really, really happy that you guys invited me to come. So I like to, when people talk about electrification, I'm like, oh, what about heating? What are we gonna do about heating? Because when we electrify space heating in Fairbanks, it's not as easy as, say, adding an air source heat pump, which you can do in Juneau pretty quickly. And I'm in Fairbanks. I'm pretty extreme cold climate centric when I talk about things, but yeah, let me, can we see my slides? Uh-oh, it's not working. There we go. So the reason I'm so focused on heating is because we are a heating dominated environment. And I think somebody in Bob said that Juneau was like 66% space heating, and Alaska averages about 70% space heating per building, and that's commercial and residential buildings. So 70% of the energy in a building is in heating, which is really, really big when you look at the lower 48. I will say, I looked this up because I was like, I'm focused on buildings. And buildings, residential and commercial buildings, are only really 17% of the energy use in Alaska. And I see we're talking about industrial applications tomorrow, which is a huge part of energy use in Alaska. I did not realize that until yesterday. So I'm learning every day. My big focus is existing buildings in Alaska. Existing buildings in Alaska have incredibly high heat loads. That's because some of them have been around 30, 40 years. They are incredibly inefficient, poorly built, and not necessarily designed for the energy costs that we have today. And in order to electrify heating in buildings, at least in existing buildings, oh, it's running without me. It is probably I'm going to say it's really cost effective to improve the efficiency of the building envelope prior to trying to electrify the heating system. This is not cutting edge technology. This is existing technology that just needs to be applied. The other thing I'm going to add, and someone touched on this already, is that it is not simple to retrofit an existing building that has a high temperature supply fluid, and that is mainly boilers. Sometimes furnaces also have high temperature, but for the most part, heat pumps can supply enough temperature to heat an air system. Boilers require at least 160 degrees in Fairbanks. Heat pumps do not deliver that high temperature heat fluid very warmly. This is a picture of baseboard. This is actually baseboard in CCHRC's building. CCHRC, this is an old photo. This is the heating plant from CCHRC's mechanical room. The one boiler doesn't exist in this anymore, but we have these two other diesel-fired boilers at the Co-Climate Housing Research Center. And this giant diesel-fired boiler that we have at our research center, the entire reason that we have this is this baseboard unit. We have 6 or 7 of these baseboard units, and we have a heat pump, but it is not capable of heating this section of the building because it doesn't provide the heat that the temperature that the baseboard needs. So I'm supposed to talk about cutting edge technology or cutting edge research. I will say heat pumps are not cutting edge. I think Bob already said he's not an early adopter. They have thousands of heat pumps in Southeast. Heat pumps have been around. In fact, I find it really entertaining. My parents had a heat pump. We built a new house in 1995. We had a heat pump. When people say to me, oh, well, heat pumps are new technology, I'm like, really? My parents were that with it? I don't think so. They've been around a long time. But heat pumps for extreme cold climates are pretty cutting edge. Air-to-air heat pumps, I think everyone has touched on this. They are really cannot be the sole heating source for most locations in Alaska. They lose efficiency and they also lose capacity as temperature gets colder. So the colder it gets, the less heat they can produce, which is kind of backwards to how Alaska works. The colder it gets, the more heat you need. So there's a big disconnect with air source heat pumps and the actual heat load that you need. I think Ingemar said well, he didn't say it, but he inferred that they're turning off the heat pumps in Kotzebue in November, which makes sense. They don't have a lot of solar starting in November, so they don't really have the offset for electricity. But it's also cold, and the colder it gets, the less efficient those units are. So I work on one ground source heat pump or geothermal heat pump, which pretty much it uses a heat sink. In my case, it's incredibly wet soils behind our building. I think it's actually in flowing groundwater at this point. The groundwater has risen in the site. In some cases in Fairbanks, we have some of these in deep lakes that don't freeze to the bottom. Some places in South Central actually have some of these that are using seawater. It's the same concept, not quite geothermal, but still a large heat sink that's not air. This heat pump, we installed it in 2012. It actually ran off and on until this past year. But what it does is it extracts heat energy from the ground, runs it through a compressor cycle, and heats our in-floor radiant heat. It cannot heat our baseboard. Our in-floor heat, the delivery temperature on our in-floor heat is 85 to 109 degrees. So this heat pump can be pretty efficient at those low temperature delivery side. The temperatures coming out of the soil, Fairbanks is, really close to being permafrost. It's got discontinuous permafrost. The site, we installed this heat pump on our site purposefully because it is underlain with permafrost. We have permanently frozen soil 30 feet below the surface. This heat, it's a coil loop, is 9 feet below the surface. So it's below the frost layer and above the permafrost layer. It's a pretty stressful location for heat extraction. There is no return of heat to the ground from this unit. And we extract heat constantly in the winter. The temperature that's coming from our ground loop is right around 0 Celsius, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. By the end of the season, it's coming in just under freezing. And And it actually returns to the ground at like 2 below Celsius, about 28 Fahrenheit. It's a pretty significant extraction of heat. But what's happening is we're actually freezing the soils. We're extracting energy from the phase change of taking the really wet, it's very wet soil, and freezing it. So far, we haven't really created permanently frozen soil. Every year it thaws in the summer. That's probably because of the groundwater on site. The efficiency of our heat pump, actually, our heat pump has performed really better than we expected. We were looking for a break-even efficiency, a COP, coefficient of performance, of 2.5. And for the most part, it's been above 2.5. The really low COP, what year was that? September 2018. We actually had a complete failure in the refrigeration cycle. That's why that COP is so low. The October COP is also low. That was on the edge of that failure in the cycle. We had to replace some parts in our unit. And the extreme variations in these, because we were thinking we were going to freeze the soil or we're going to lose efficiency over time. And what's really happened is our efficiency fluctuates over the course of the year. In the fall, we have pretty high COP because the ground is its warmest. And in the spring, the COP is a little lower because the ground is the coldest. But most of the fluctuations in this efficiency have to do with mechanical problems, mechanical failures, either of the heat pump or of the circulation pumps. And the lessons that I've learned just working with this one heat pump system since 2012, first of all, install costs are pretty high for a ground source heat pump. This one was actually much higher. It's been a few years since I looked at costs, but it's on the order of $30,000 to install a ground loop and a heat pump. We found them to be really efficient, and the higher, why does this keep doing that? Sorry, the higher the diesel cost, the more economic the heat pump. When we installed this heat pump, diesel costs were incredibly high, and we expected to have some kind of payback within 15 years. Diesel prices dropped a lot over the course of the last 8 years, and it's barely breaking even in a year. Although now diesel prices are back up, I expect it's going to do much better this coming year. And yeah, the temperatures hover around freezing in Fairbanks. Different locations in the state are certainly going to have higher ground temperatures. Although I suspect we have pretty marginal soils. Most of the state is probably going to hover right around freezing. And then the one thing that I haven't heard from anyone so far in the presentation is about the local workforce. My heat pump has been offline. Well, it broke in December. It kept tripping the breaker. We could not figure out what was wrong with it. We could not find anyone in Fairbanks to service it. It is kind of working at the moment, but heat pumps in Fairbanks, in interior Alaska, all heat pumps, there are very few companies that actually work with heat pumps. It's a special, and I don't know, maybe refrigeration companies, but I've had a very hard time getting this serviced. I talked to the one heat pump installer that I know of in South Central Alaska recently. That's one in all of Alaska outside of Southeast. I don't know what's going on in Southeast. So developing a local workforce is a big need in moving towards heat pumps for heating in Alaska. And then do I have time to take questions? It looks like I have a few moments. Do we have any questions?
Well, thank you very much, Robin. That's a great message. So, when we talk about heat pumps, let's not forget about the building envelope and making the building envelope more efficient, because at the end we can achieve the highest savings. with a systems approach. I love that message. Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat. We do have a couple of minutes left here, so I'm going to encourage people to put in their questions. And since I don't see any, I get to be the one to ask a question. So, like you alluded to it. So with the recent increase in oil prices, and we know that in Alaska, we heavily rely on oil for heating buildings in many locations. Have you seen increased interest in heat pumps? And if so, even if not, are you expecting increased interest? And how are you preparing for that?
Yes, I'm expecting increased interest. I haven't fielded a lot of questions recently. I do have a few projects in South Central, but outside of South Central, I haven't had a lot of questions about heat pumps. And part of the reason is we don't have an installer in the Fairbanks area right now. So the one installer that will come up to Fairbanks also works in Wasilla and Palmer and Anchorage and the Kenai. So that's one installer. It usually takes a week or more to do an install just to the ground loop. So it's not a simple get in line. It's a get in line and wait multiple seasons. And that's the biggest problem. And actually, I do have a project this coming year in Fairbanks, and I don't know how we're going to get it installed. So I'm going to plan now to have it installed in 3 years is kind of where I am. But yeah, diesel prices are well above the cutoff for an efficient, cost-effective heat pump right now.
Well, thank you very much again. We are out of time for live questions, but there are questions populating in the chat. So I'm going to encourage everybody to continue the discussion in the chat. And thank you very much, Robin, again for the wonderful presentation and the wonderful work you have been doing. And I'm going to move on to the next speaker. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Armando Casillas, who has been a scientific engineering associate at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab since 2019. He works in a number of projects related to building energy efficiency, grid interactiveness and flexibility, and HVAC fault detection and diagnostics. During his undergraduate years, Armando worked as an energy analyst at UC Merced Facilities Management for 2 years, where he was exposed to highly automated building systems, including HVAC, and has also worked for the Energy Conservation Office at UC Davis, performing continuous commissioning. His master's work was conducted at the Western Cooling Efficiency Center, which involved wireless sensing for building leakage diagnostic applications. Armando holds an MS in Energy Systems from UC Davis and a BS in Mechanical Engineering from UC Merced. Well, it's a real pleasure to have you, Armando. Thank you for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thanks so much for inviting me. Hello, everyone. My name is Armando Casillas. I am a scientific engineering associate at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory as a member of the Building Technologies and Urban Systems Division. I should probably share my screen here. First I'd like to thank Tom once again for inviting me to speak to you all. Although I am a part of a national lab, our immediate vantage point is through the lens of California issues and policies. So it is a privilege and a pleasure to be able to hear about the wonderful work being done to advance these technologies in the context of the state of Alaska's needs and policies. So in more specific terms, I am what they call at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, a building engineer, building scientist, and the majority of my work focuses on the mechanical and digital systems that exist in buildings. My work can be divided into two different bins. I do a lot of researchy, low technology readiness level developing technologies, as well as industry facing high technology readiness level work focused on validating and deploying a lot of these technologies that I'll be talking about in a little bit. So I have quite a bit of slides, kind of quite the opposite of Robin. So I'm going to try to get through them really quickly, and definitely, hopefully, leave some room for questions at the end. So for those who don't know, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory is primarily funded by the Department of Energy, with the rest of our portfolio being rounded out by funding from state agencies such as California Energy Commission and our investor-owned utilities such as PG&E, SoCal Edison. LBNL, the Building Technologies and Urban Systems Division in particular, is more focused on developing research around energy management and information systems, data analytics, as well as technologies to integrate systems such as HVAC in conjunction with other DERs such as battery storage and lighting. HVAC controls, optimization and controls is a big focus for us as well, at least the team that I'm working with. And we have a whole department focused on development of simulation tools and packages, which I will also touch on shortly in this presentation. So this is the obligatory California duct curve slide. So for those who aren't familiar, this is the net load profile of California's electricity grid. As we have adopted increased levels of renewable energy on the grid, this has introduced a level of intermittence and volatility. In California in particular, the higher levels of solar generation have created periods of low to negative net load, which creates instability in the grid and leads to curtailment of these resources. And curtailment is ultimately wasteful and mostly hurts us, the ratepayers, who pay for the electricity. In addition, evening hours, see the reduction of this generation source and introduce a steep increase in net load, which increases the stress on the grid and can introduce carbon-intensive power generations with peaker plants that use natural gas in California, all emitting greenhouse gases. So the place buildings come in is given that the buildings buildings in general are high consumers of electricity. As you see here in this slide, we have in most developed countries, buildings consume 30 to 40% of the total primary energy. And the U.S. in particular consume about 75% of the nation's total electricity and contribute to nearly 80% of the peak demand in the nation. And if you think about, I kind of like to call it the four horsemen of building energy consumption. We have a lot of places in the U.S. that have to condition the space for excessive heat. In Alaska, you have excessive cold. You also have humidity that the HVAC systems that need to take care of. And most recently, we've been focusing on keeping the air that occupants in the buildings breathe clean, low CO2 levels, PM 2.5, especially in California, all the wildfires and airborne pathogens with COVID recently. The recent push for electrification of gas-fueled loads, with heat pumps that we're talking about today, will only increase the stress on the grid, given that we're now shifting all of that over to electricity. And traditionally in California, at least, we've seen a big peak in HVAC load in the summer for cooling, but we will start to see that as well in the wintertime as we electrify those loads. So this is where our field of study comes in, which is best summarized by a recent initiative from DOE called the Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Initiative, which is aimed to rethink the way we look at buildings as resources and energy efficiency and demand flexibility, we call it. Buildings have all of this technology, information, and with that, we want to leverage this to promote intelligent buildings of the future, to promote our transition to a cleaner, more reliable grid. As you see in the last bullet point, it is projected that GEBs, as we call them, can provide the country 200 billion in U.S. power system cost savings over the next 20 years, which equates to about 80 million tons of CO2 emission reduction by 2030, and that's an annual reduction. This makes it a pretty high priority in our work here at the lab, promoting DOE's vision. So from this concept, I can start talking about some of the work our team does. And we have a big portfolio of projects that covers different aspects of this GAB initiative. And I'll quickly dive into them. So in terms of how HVAC systems play a role in this, in particular heat pumps that we're talking about today, HVAC systems can provide demand flexibility in a number of forms, which in addition to predominantly being the highest load in most commercial and residential buildings, are one of the only systems, if you think about it, in a building that actually move, right? Like the buildings are these sort of static, dynamic things, but we have these components that are constantly moving, and we can take advantage of that for flexibility. This involves a lot of controls programming, however, the knowledge which I'm personally getting better at, and our team in general is focusing on developing optimized controls to take advantage of the flexibility these systems can provide and optimize it for different objectives. So I talked a little bit about the modeling that our team does and the building technologies and urban systems. One of the main ways buildings, give me 1 second. But most of our work at BTUS is carried out in 2 different ways. One of which is through modeling. So modeling is an integral part of our workflows, at least mine, and allows us to perform parametric analysis on the effects of different strategies, whole building energy consumption, and has allowed us most recently to take advantage of higher fidelity modeling via the Modelica modeling language to perform a controls-oriented simulation to determine optimal ways of controlling our building systems. So although I think modeling can be fun and pretty rewarding, I would say it's definitely not as fun as working in our experimental facilities. So the other way our work is carried out is via our state-of-the-art experimental facility called FlexLab. So you see here, FlexLab is behind me in my virtual background, as well as in the picture here. FlexLab is our state-of-the-art facility and includes customizable spaces and HVAC systems to test out a large number of different combination of systems. This is the team I work with here at LBL, executing a lot of this work in these facilities. So some examples of what we can do. So FlexLab experimentation allows us to carry out lifelike experimental designs, taking into account envelope construction, occupancy patterns, and highly granular measurements of environmental conditions, including occupant comfort. All of our data is measured and collected and visualized, which better helps us paint a picture of our test results and takeaways to relevant stakeholders. So what you can see here is a couple examples of how we do this. We have an occupant simulators that emit the heat that a human would. We have female and male simulators that put out the average heat of a person, as well as plug load simulators here, the lower half here are able to simulate what the plug load would be of a desktop computer, but also emit the same amount of heat that you'd get from a plug load like that. And you see here as well, we have the thermal comfort stations that we use to develop comfort metrics during our experiments. This is just an example of one of the experiments we've carried out called Harbor in the Loop, where we are actually developing a test setup for heat pump controls, which I'll go over in a little bit. This is the standard side-by-side sort of setup we have at FlexLab. So the beauty about FlexLab is we have these 2 identical cells right next to each other. We can run a control scenario in one cell, and in the other cell, test some of the new technologies that we're developing to develop characteristics, and we're able to actually quantify the benefits that these technologies provide using the side-by-side approach, using the other one as a baseline, basically, to give us pretty meaningful data. So this is first of 2 projects I'll be talking about pretty heavily. One of them is this HP Flex project, where we're actually trying to develop optimal controls for heat pumps to respond to prices. So currently in California, we have this time of use rate where you have basically an off peak and a high peak. And as we start developing these pricing mechanisms, we'll shift eventually. We're hoping to shift to more dynamic pricing over time. So this is one way that we're making these systems more grid interactive. And grid interactive can be many things depending on what you want to optimize for, right? So I have a little little animation here where we're really optimizing in this case for greenhouse gases. So this is using the Texas grid signal. In Texas, you have a lot of wind energy in the beginning of the day, overnight. And what this optimizer is doing is reducing the amount of greenhouse gases the system uses over time, while at the same time maintaining comfort in the building, right? So as you see here, I'll play it again. The system is going to preheat the building to optimize during the lowest greenhouse gas intensive time of the day and avoid that high emissions rate later on in the morning. Whereas the baseline scenario is just going to turn on when it wants to. And what you're seeing is an over 50% reduction in greenhouse gases. So this is just one way that our optimizer, our MPC, can provide this service. So this is currently being deployed in FlexLab, as I mentioned. We have this optimizer that we have in one cell, and the other cell we're running a baseline scenario to just really quantify the savings and quantify the benefit that this system can provide. This is just an example of some of the results of that. The orange line here on the top plot is the optimized controller. You see that a lot of that load is shifted away from that peak time, and we're actually able to show this very well in our FlexLab facility. I know I have less than a minute left, so I'm just going to quickly go over this here. This is pretty exciting technology. We're going to be combining heat pumps with the thermal energy storage phase change material batteries, and we've developed both a techno-economic analysis tool to develop how cost-effective these systems can be, as well as optimal controls for these systems as well. So this is just an example of the prototype that we developed here at the lab, combining the thermal energy storage system you see here on the lower left with the air-to-water heat pump system on the right here. And with these, you can really enhance flexibility with the storage provided by those phase change material batteries. Most recently, we showed this technology to Jennifer Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, and we were able to present to her some of these exciting technologies and controls strategies that we're developing at the lab, all in a national context. As you see here, we're deploying a lot of these heat pump optimal controls, 6 in California. We have sites in 6 in California, different sites there, as well as 2 in New York. And we're also the national coordinator for the Connected Communities program for DOE. And we have about 6, I think, out of 10 sites there that also involve heat pumps. So this is sort of being deployed at a national scale, and we're pretty excited about this as well. So I know I'm over time. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer questions if there's time after. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Armando. It's really exciting to learn about the capabilities at your lab and the really cool project. So thank you so much for sharing all that with us. It's a real pleasure to have you. We are out of time for questions, but I'm going to encourage everybody to continue the discussion in the chat. And I'm excited to now introduce our next speakers. Our next speaker is Dr. Ron Domitrovic, who is the program manager of Electric Power Research Institute's Customer Technologies P170 research area. He is responsible for guiding EPRA's research related to end-use equipment, including lighting, data centers, appliances, air conditioning, water heating, and refrigeration for application in energy efficiency, demand response, and other customer use cases. Prior to EPRI, he was the president of Redwood Electric, providing construction services for electrical and specialty systems. In his early career, he conducted research at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory Building Technology Center. He's an active member of ASHRAE, where he has served on technical committees, including TC 8.7, variable refrigerant flow. He has published numerous papers and articles on thermal systems. He received a BS from Carnegie Mellon University, an MS from the University of Florida, and a PhD from the University of Tennessee. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ron, and the floor is all yours.
I've heard a lot of discussion about heat pumps and so forth. And so, Alaska is like the most wonderful frontier for trying to test advanced low temperature heat pumps. So one of the most common questions I get asked or discussions I get into is that there are many, many different types of heat pumps. A heat pump is not one thing. And for each style of heat pump, there are different application spaces, there are different details and so forth. And you can go to the next slide now, if you don't mind. That there's a whole variety of heat pumps. And even within those varieties, there are specific different types. So there's some that are appropriate for apartments and houses and commercial spaces and tall buildings and industrial facilities and so forth. And so it's very important that when you embark on trying to electrify whatever you're electrifying, be it residential spaces or industrial spaces, et cetera, that you have an understanding of what the different types are and how they apply to different situations. And so that's one of the most important educational parts or activities that we partake in at EPRI in the heat pump and the electrification space. If you go to the next slide, please, Tom. So this is just a very simple illustration that it's one thing to have a technology that is efficient or capable, but nobody wants. And so on the left side, you see the curlicue compact fluorescent. This is a much kind of despised technology. I mean, it was loved by the greenest of the tree huggers, but by the masses, people didn't really like it. It gave off funny light. They were quirky and so forth. But that technology has evolved into the LED. And on the right side, you now see the filament LED light that is now ubiquitous. It's the choice product because it's a better product than the incandescent bulb that it ultimately replaced. And so my point here is that heat pumps can be that technology too. We have to remember that they're competing with what's very easy, and that is to simply burn fossil fuel and get high temperature heat and do with it as we please. But the heat pump ultimately can be a better product. It's more efficient. It can be more comfortable. It can be more flexible. It can be, ultimately just a better use of resources and something that supplies better functionality to the end user. Next slide, please, Tom. So this is a simulation. Obviously, I'm stuck here in the lower 48. I'm actually in Knoxville, Tennessee, where it's about 80 degrees today. And so this is a simulation that we did a number of years ago, actually, but it's so good that we keep using it. It's a simulation we ran in Atlanta, Georgia, using a traditional single-speed heat pump and then what's called a variable capacity heat pump. So, and that's a very important distinction, that we hear a lot about heat pumps now. I mean, the last 2 years, the amplification of discussion about heat pumps is incredible. For somebody like me who's been doing this for 25 plus years, to hear the clamor over heat pumps is really fascinating. It used to be kind of a niche area. But there's a fundamental change in heat pump technology that happened maybe 10 to 15 years ago. And because we might ask, well, we've had heat pumps for decades. Well, why can't we just suddenly use heat pumps and save the planet that way? And it's because there are some difficulties with it. And the traditional heat pump, this is prior to about 10 to 15 years ago, is a single speed system. It means that the compressor and the fans, but ultimately the compressor, which is the power behind how a heat pump does what it does, was a single speed device, meaning it was on or it was off, and then you modulated heat or modulated capacity by turning it on or off. Well, about 15 or so years ago, the inverter drive was added to compressors, and lo and behold, we had something called the variable capacity heat pump. This is a much different system. It's flexible. You can change the speed of the compressor and thereby change the outputs. You can change the capacity that's produced by the machine over a very wide range, or reasonably wide range, and allow it to kind of overproduce capacity, if you will, produce more heating capacity than its single speed counterpart would produce. And this is a very, very important part. It's the fundamental technology that allows heat pumps now to be deployed in cold climates. Or it's one of several, but I would say it's the most fundamental. And so what the graph illustrates is that with a single speed system, you get a lot of heat out of the system, but you have to supplement it with a lot of electric resistance secondary heat in order to catch the peak, the coldest of the hours. When you go to a variable capacity system, you can all but eliminate those periods. And if you upsize a little bit, you can completely eliminate them. And that's sort of the fundamental design technology and approach that has to be taken into consideration when you're designing for cold climates. If you would go to the next slide, please. All right, so variable capacity systems are now all over the markets. I would imagine that in Alaska, that's probably the majority of what's being put in, given your very high lift conditions, very high temperature lift conditions. But this is a snapshot I took at a recent trade show that shows a Mitsubishi system. So they have a line called the Hyper system. And on the bottom, you see the latest version of that, which is the H2i Plus. It's kind of the Hyper squared, I guess. And note that it can provide up to 100% of its heating capacity. That's its nominal rated capacity at 47 degrees. But it can produce 100% of that heating capacity at -5 Fahrenheit. How does it do that? It does two things. One, it has an inverter-driven compressor, so it can spin that compressor faster. But it does another thing, and it uses something called vapor injection. And why is that important? That's important because several people had mentioned earlier that efficiency degrades. Capacity and efficiency degrade as the temperature lift increases. So the temperature lift is the temperature from the outside versus the temperature you want to get to on the inside. And as that gets bigger, it gets harder to produce capacity, and you produce that capacity less efficiently. So the inverter drive helps with capacity, but in order to help with efficiency, they do something called vapor injection. And that is a way of cooling the compression process as it's happening in order to make it a more efficient process. So the reason that efficiency is difficult or degrades away as temperature lift goes up is because of that compression process. It's a nonlinear process. As you get to higher and higher compression ratios, trying to get to higher and higher temperature lifts, each unit you go up costs you more and more energy. And so by using vapor injection, you can kind of cheat the system a little bit and gain back a bit of efficiency. Okay, next slide, if you would, please. So this is an example that I pulled out of some data that we have. We have a variety of field sites of air source heat pumps in residential houses across the lower 48. But luckily for us, or luckily for this talk to you folks in Alaska, we had a polar vortex a year and a half ago, and it affected Texas and Nebraska and so forth. And we happen to have a variety of systems under test in those states. So we have some very good data of the operation of these variable capacity systems in residences in these very cold temperatures. So this is one example. And some things to draw out of it is that at -19 Fahrenheit, this relatively ordinary system, this is a Train system, Train XV system, by the way, it was able to produce 80 Fahrenheit air, supply air, at -19 Fahrenheit. Now that's relatively cool for a heat pump, but it's enough to keep the house warm. And with 5 kilowatts of auxiliary electric heat, it was able to maintain 102, which is perfectly sufficient for maintaining the heat and the temperature in that house. So this is a house in Nebraska that was weathering the storm at -19 Fahrenheit with a relatively ordinary air source heat pump. With other designs and technologies like vapor injection and oversizing and so forth, you can design a proper system for effectively any temperature range. Okay, next slide, please. I mentioned, oh, good, this one isn't here. I wasn't sure about that. This is a quick insight document that EPRI produced last year after this polar vortex that just discusses how systems behave in extreme temperatures. So you're welcome to download that and look at it and read it, and I can certainly send the link at a future time, or after the meeting. And then I'll go one more slide and then I'm done. If you would, please. I mentioned the lift. So, and other people had talked earlier about the difference between air source systems, water source systems, and then hydronic systems. The most difficult nut to crack is air source hydronic heating, because you're going from the coldest outdoor temperature to the hottest indoor temperature. So often gas-fired hydronic systems need to produce water in the 160-degree range. So that's the hardest heat pump to develop, but there is technology under development for that. And last slide, if you would, one more, and then I am done. So Danfoss, a compressor manufacturer and component manufacturer, has something called an oilless centrifugal compressor, specifically for high lift applications. So this would be for larger systems, centrifugal 40. Up to maybe 400-ton type systems for commercial buildings, schools, campuses, etc. So this kind of technology is finding its way into products by Smart Chiller Group, by Multistack, and so forth, that is attempting to start to crack that nut of the very, very high lift hydronic systems. So a lot of development. I wish I had a little bit more time, but thank you very much for your attention, and happy to answer any questions either via talk or chat.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's really exciting to hear about the advancements in heat pump technology and how it's increasing the possibilities for using the technology today. Thanks so much for sharing all that with us. We are out of time for live questions, unfortunately, but I'm gonna certainly encourage everybody to continue the discussion in the chat. So thank you so much again, Ron, and let's move on to our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Andy Meadham, who works as a research engineer at the Idaho National Lab. And his research and development focus is on modeling power systems, system integration, co-simulation, and hardware-in-the-loop testing. He is involved and has led several projects for offices like Vehicle Technologies Office, Fuel Cell Technologies Office, Office of Electricity, etc. He received his master's degree in electrical engineering with a specialization in power and energy systems from Arizona State University. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Andy, and the floor is all yours.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for inviting me for this panel session. I'm very excited to share my research, and it's been a pretty wonderful session so far from what I've heard from the previous panel members. So I'm working as a research engineer here at Idaho National Lab for past 7 years. And as Tom described, I've been majorly working on power and energy systems. And my main focus is on modeling transmission or distribution system, and then connecting any of the loads like, let's say, electric vehicle or electrolyzer or any other loads, and see the impacts of that on the grid. I also connect some of the sources like solar, PV, or supercapacitor and batteries, and see the impacts on the grid. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that whatever load or energy resources that you're adding, it is kind of beneficial to the grid in a way, and it is not there are not too many adverse reactions or impacts on the grid. So in this my presentation, I will be introducing you about the different electric vehicles, the types of electric vehicles, and etc., and the motivation behind this project, which is called microgrid fast charging station, why and how, and then conclude about what are the results that we found and what is in store in the future for us. So as many of you know, that EV sales have been increasing rapidly, and it is rising exponentially. And the forecast has been that it will be around 30% by 2020 and 45% by 2035. But the recent forecasts are even predicting that it could be more than 50% by 2035. So with this kind of penetration of electric vehicles and as well as the major car companies, it be Volkswagen or Tesla or Toyota, even for that matter, who had been reluctant to join the electric vehicle bandwagon, and they were focusing on their fuel cell cars. Even they are coming into the electric vehicle domain. So with almost all major car companies planning or scheduling their all electric vehicles to be up by 2030 or 2040, the impact on the grid will be huge. And currently, right now, we have around 115,000 charging stations installed, and this involves both, or not both, level 1, level 2, and level 3 charging stations. Level 1 is usually, it's more or less not used anymore, but we have level 2 and fast charging. I think Michelle kind of explained about the level 2 and the fast charging, or the level 3 fast charging stations. So I will not go way too deep into it. So basically level 2 is usually used at houses, or if it is a commercial charger where publicly you can charge your vehicle. And for the most part, over here, we had been using level 2, and recently, from past 2 or 3 years, we have shifted into DC fast charging, where the typical rating is around 150 kilowatts at least, though the rated capacity is more than 50 kilowatt. With 150 kilowatt as the DC fast charger for most of the vehicles, and Tesla has what is as its Tesla supercharger at 250 kilowatt, and right now we even have extreme fast charger which charge at a rate of 350 kilowatt, and as of now it is being tested within the labs. So I think it's going to take a very less time for us to see extreme fast chargers where we'll be charging our electric vehicles in 10 minutes or so. With this, also the penetration level increasing. So we need around 330,000 charging stations by 2035. So with so many charging stations, the load is definitely going to increase on the grid. And this would be around 10% by 2035 and 38% by 2050. So this is a load which is unpredictable compared to other loads that we usually have, let's say HVAC or the regular housing load that we have. But with electric vehicles, the problem arises when there is no schedule of when a car will be charged or discharged. So that is one of the concerns. And as well as the current grid, which has been built decades ago, and there has been not much of an upgrade. So it is not designed to handle this much of load right now. So this will cause overloading of the feeder. You will have harmonics, you will have degradation of the transformers. You will have to upgrade the transformers for you to withstand the large current and voltage. So with this as a background, we are also, the other part is we are also looking at the net zero carbon emission, right? So many of the utilities and some of the states have already pledged that they would want to be 100% clean electric. So this also has an impact on the grid where we are not sure if any additional load will be able to be satisfied by the renewable sources, because it's not easy for you to just get an additional load when you don't, there is, with the renewable sources, one of the things is its predictability. It is not guaranteed. So we need something of a base system where we know that this is the amount of load that we have, and then we can continue with it. So with this as the motivation, we are thinking of what is called as a microgrid fast charging station, where a fast charging station will have its own solar PV, a battery, maybe even a super capacitor, where it is not dependent on the grid, and it is able to satisfy the requirements of the electric vehicles on its own. And hopefully if it has enough energy, then it can also provide the energy back to the grid, thereby giving the ancillary services to the grid. So with this as the template, we were looking at how do we develop a microgrid fast charging station and model that particular system and validate it. So this project has been funded by the Office of Electricity, Department of Energy, and this is in partnership with Xendi. They are the people who have been developing a platform where you can model the systems. Let's say if you have a distribution system, then you model it, you put the solar PV or the loads or the charging stations, and then you optimize the location of each of them, and thereby you get a cost-effective fast charging station. So this is the way we have designed, the methods we have followed is first design this microgrid fast charging station in the Xendi platform. And once that is designed, then we would be modeling the same system in a digital real-time simulator. I'll explain in detail what it is, then perform the use cases and validate the framework that has been designed. So while designing this microgrid in Xendi platform, these were the main factors that we considered. So one is the infrastructure cost. Like right now we say there might be 20 megawatt of demand. That is the peak demand. So what happens if there is 50 or 60 megawatt of demand in an year or two? So what should be the design of this particular charging station? So for that, we have taken into consideration the infrastructure cost, like how much does it cost to upgrade any of the systems or get new charging station and stuff. What are the unit sizes? Like if you are adding a solar PV or anything, what should be the capacity of each solar PV? And the driving distances is what is the distance between one charging station and another charging station, so that you can optimize that. DR technology cost, this again was either a battery or a solar PV, and some of the partnership or the electric goals that we have with the private and public partnerships. So taking all this into consideration, we had another partner, UCSD, University of California, San Diego, who were gracious enough to share their campus system data, the distribution system data, and they already have several solar PVs. They have fast chargers where I think 10 of them are level 2 and everything else is fast charging, DC fast charging. So using that data, the Xendi were able to model that system in their platform, and they ran some power system analysis. So basically running the low flow analysis such that whatever design has been done, at least electrically, it is stable. And at INL, we model the same UCSD network in our RTDS. It's called RTDS, where it's a digital real-time simulator. The reason we use a digital real-time simulator is because all the computation works in real time. And when I say real time, it is the clock time. If a fault happens for 1 second, the fault actually happens for 1 second over here, and it is not the simulated time. And the other advantage of using a DRTS is you can perform hardware in the loop simulation, where you can connect any of the other loads or resources directly to the system and then study the impacts on that. And we usually run, for power system analysis, we usually run the system at around 50 microsecond. So this gives us the data for us to perform transient analysis. So this system has a central natural gas coal-fired plant. We had a battery system, a fuel cell, and around 28 PV system. And to model the lines, we used the pi model blocks in the RTDS, where we had the zero sequence and the primary sequence, positive sequence impedances. And for the PV modeling, we used the dynamic source, which would represent the average current injection. For us, it was important to see that whenever a PV is added, what would be the impact of the grid with its current carrying capacity. And for the EV loads, we used the Raspberry Pi cards, where each pie chart would represent an electric vehicle. We got the charging data from the UCSD itself. They had all the data at when does a car come for charging, at what time, when does it leave, what is the initial state of charge it is at, and what is the final SOC when it leaves. So the image that you see right now is a test setup where we have every electric vehicle represented in a pie chart, and it is connected to the digital real-time simulator where we are modeled in RTDS, and the communication happens through something called a GTNet socket.
Just a quick time check. We have about 1 minute left, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to speed up. So we did 2 different use cases. One is called a grid connected use case, and one would be the islanded case. So in grid connected, we are looking at a total EV charging capacity of around 6 megawatts, and the DRs which were already present in the campus was able to provide up to 85% of the energy needs. So for the most part, the system is usually stable, but what we are looking at over here is if we have to upgrade, where are the locations at which you can possibly upgrade. So this is what we were looking at. And in the islanded use case, this is what the main part of our project, where we are looking at to see if this fast charging station can act as a microgrid. So we have only considered one of the feeders and not the whole feeder system. And the total EV charging capacity was around 4 megawatt. And for each of these 2 use cases, we have what is called as a baseline scenario, basically looking at the existing data, whatever is available at that particular location. And we have the infrastructure upgrade where we are upgrading the chargers as well as the solar PV that we are adding. With that, what the main aspect of our testing was to make sure that whatever Zendy designed in their platform, we were able to validate. And the basic load flows analysis results that you see are within the 5% range. And I think this is one of the main graphs. I'll be fast. So if you can see here, one of the test cases, what we did was to see what happens if there is a extreme load increase on the grid. And if you see that over here at the top, you see the frequency response, which has fallen a lot, and the current has increased and voltage has also reduced. The problem with the issue over here was the under voltage frequency that you see, which is pretty close to the 1547 standards where you're within the range. But the one positive is that the system was stable pretty soon. In conclusion, I think I will skip considering the time limit. The only consideration is that a fast charging station can act as a microgrid, and we have performed several different extreme use cases and seen that the system has been stable. For the future work, we are looking at what are the communication protocols that we can use for a vehicle to grid or vehicle to building, and what would be the impact by having different renewable sources, let's say hydropower. And I'm also a part of the IEEE 2030.13 working group where we are with the private and national labs and other non-profit organizations. We are looking at the way where we can standardize the protocols that we'll be using for the communication. All right, I think I'm already over the time, so thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Anudeep. It's really interesting to learn about how to handle the increased demand created by EV charging. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. We don't have time for live questions, but I'm going to encourage everybody to continue the discussion in the chat. And I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Adam Davis, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Plug-in Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Research Center of the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California, Davis. His work at UC Davis is focused on electric vehicles adoption and infrastructure modeling, and his broader research interests include travel behavior, urban geography, spatial analysis, and baseball analytics. Thank you so much for joining us, Adam, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tom. Really excited to be presenting here, and loved all the other presentations about heat pumps, generally electrifying things. This is a really exciting and interesting research area, so I'm happy to contribute. Okay, cool. So my talk today will basically be about the work that my research center does to look at electric vehicle adoption, modeling basically who's going to get EVs, what kinds of chargers they're going to need, where we should put those, how much it's going to cost, things like that. I'm going to talk about this both sort of in the context of California, where we do a lot of our research, and then also sort of more broadly for the rest of the United States, and then some specific considerations for thinking about electric vehicles in Alaska. I put some links here to a couple of online tools that we've developed to explore EV adoption. I can drop links to those in the chat after I'm done presenting. So first, a general kind of context on like what's going on here and where we're headed. California right now is leading the country in EV adoption. We've had really heavy push from state government, basically. Sort of in addition to the federal subsidies for purchasing new electric vehicles, California's put heavy duty subsidies on that, and also subsidized charger installation in a lot of cases. And then the major driver of all of this has also been California's ZEV mandate. So, which is a requirement by the state government that, like, if you want to sell any new cars in California, a certain percent of them must be ZEVs, which is mainly battery electric vehicles, but also plug-in hybrids and a small number of fuel cell vehicles. And basically, this is sort of an extra emissions rule that California is able to put on vehicle sales, is something that we've basically done to really accelerate EV adoption. And this rule, which is currently like 10 or 15% of new vehicle sales, is supposed to hit about 50 to 60% of new vehicle sales by 2030, and then 100% by 2035. And a number of other states, like there's 11 other states that have also joined the ZEV mandate and are also trying to reach 100% ZEV sales, or primarily electric vehicle sales, by 2035. Meanwhile, there are also federal targets that are being set. These targets are generally a little bit lower, or a lot lower. And if you add up the sort of the ZEV states and see what's left over for the non-ZEV mandate states, what you get basically is this plot on the right shows sort of what this rate of EV sales would do to the sort of overall rate of EV ownership in different states. The blue curve is what would happen if California basically just misses its target. So it doesn't quite get to 100% sales by 2035. It gets to maybe 95% sales by then. But you'll see is that by 2040, 2044, 2045 will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% electric vehicles on the roads. The other states that have a ZEV mandate will be a little bit further behind because they haven't started at quite the same level that California has. And then the states that don't have quite as aggressive a push will be, at that point, 20 to 30% lower, or you can think about it that as being, maybe 5 to 10 years sort of behind in the adoption space. And the idea here is that basically this is being pushed really heavily by government regulations and subsidies, but it's also generally becoming cheaper because these are new technologies that are getting expanded. As the previous presenter noted, many car companies are basically saying that they're going to switch to electric vehicles no matter what. So basically, as more and more companies do this, electric vehicles will get cheaper, more reliable, more affordable, things like that. So the research that my center does, and the research that I do, mainly focuses on sort of identifying, taking these sales targets as inputs and then saying, where do we think these vehicles are going to go? Specifically, who's going to buy them? What kinds of households? How are they going to get used? How are they going to get charged? Things like that. So when we think about doing that, we mainly do this at a household level. So our work in California is really focused on looking at specifically which kinds of households are likeliest to buy electric vehicles. And so our analysis, we've got a paper in review at the journal Energy Policy right now that goes into this as sort of basically traces the route from where we are now, where about 5% of the vehicles in California are EVs, to 2045, when about 100% will be, or close to 100%, hopefully. And what we see is that basically so far, electric vehicle adoption has been fastest among households that can afford to purchase new vehicles. So they're higher income generally, because these are just not only new cars, which are already expensive, but electric vehicles, which have, batteries are expensive. They're generally new technology and batteries are really expensive. People who can plug these vehicles in at home. So this is people with single family homes, especially detached single family homes that have a full size garage. and especially also homeowners who can basically afford and have the authority to install charging equipment. We also see adoption being fastest among households that have multiple vehicles, so that they can basically keep one internal combustion vehicle that doesn't have the battery range limitation for use on long trips. And then the single most common use of electric vehicles in California and elsewhere has been for basically predictable high mileage driving. So this is specifically like fairly long commutes, because if you have a long commute, it's the same distance every day. You can be really, really sure that you can do it within your electric vehicle's range, your battery range. And if you can charge at home and get to work and back, that's great. If you can maybe also charge at work, then you're totally set. But basically anything that is like relatively high mileage, because electric vehicles are cheaper to operate per mile than gas-powered vehicles, like much, much, much cheaper. But also really, really predictable, so that you know that you'll get to a place where you can charge and where you'll be able to spend, the 8 hours or so it takes to reach a full battery on level 2 charging. But as we're going forward, what we're going to really need to do is basically reach a wider range of households and uses. So this will rely somewhat on the increasing availability of electric SUVs and trucks, and also just generally making these vehicles cheaper and, more reliable, available at a wider range of sizes, and just something that makes sense for a wider range of households and not just like high-income single-family home owners with long commutes. And the takeaways that we have for California is that this transition is going to be really, really a lot of work. We're going to need to install just tons and tons and tons of chargers. On this graph, the purple line is the number of new chargers that'll be installed in single-family homes each year to sort of reach California's electrification targets. The gold line is new shared chargers, this is workplaces, public locations, transit hubs, things like that. This is level 2 chargers. The DC fast chargers are sort of a separate deal, but DC fast chargers, because you can charge a lot more for them, are actually something that more companies are looking into installing sort of without direct government support. The y-axis here is chargers. So in California, there are 25 million vehicles. Alaska is about 2% as big in terms of vehicle fleet, and also about 10 years behind. So if you, adjusted those numbers down from 500,000 to 10,000 or something like that, that would be about the middle of the graph, and just shifted it out. The amount of installation effort needed in a place like Alaska will be a lot lower than in a place like California. And you also have the opportunity to spread it out a lot more, because this adoption will be happening a lot slower. So in California, we're trying to reach, something like 100% of the vehicles on the road in the next 15 years, or next 15 to 20 years. In other states, you've got more opportunity to plan ahead, which will generally make it a lot cheaper. In terms of costs, this is the annual installation costs based on sort of what we generally see electric vehicle chargers costing now. And as you can see, it's really, really a lot of money. So this is again for California. Alaska is much smaller. But the largest cost here and the largest place for uncertainty is actually public DC fast charging. So this is along sort of long distance transit corridors. It's also really, really important for TNCs like Uber and Lyft, places that have really, really, really a lot of miles in a day really heavily use DC fast charging. But the idea is that if we're thinking so far, electric vehicle infrastructure planning has been sort of on the order of, $1 to $10 billion investments from the federal government, and smaller investments from state governments. But if we're trying to actually hit, 100% of vehicles on the road being electric vehicles, the actual costs of this transition are going to be much, much, much higher than that. What this graph shows is that our assessment of charging needs in California are going to be on the order of, several $1 billion per year for pretty much the entire 2030s. And California is, a big state, but the country is much bigger than California. The amount of money that's going to need to get spent on electric vehicle charging infrastructure is really, really important, or really, really large. Which means targeting that investment to specific places where it'll provide the most benefit is really important. So the way that we do that is with the UC Davis EV planning toolbox, which is basically this sort of interactive scenario tool that lets you adjust various different parameters for EV adoption and look at find the areas where we're going to expect to see the most EVs under a given scenario, and then also the most charging demand. The inputs that this tool takes are existing EV ownership numbers, income levels, housing type distributions, commute distance, because long distance commutes are actually pretty beneficial for electric vehicles, And then there's a neighborhood effect, which you could treat as a proxy for politics or various other things like that. But generally, we see areas where there are just more higher rates of EV adoption, sort of independent of the other variables that we're looking at. And one of the sort of hypothesized things here is that if you know people and talk to people who use EVs, you'll see that they're, totally workable for most people, although they are still very costly. We also look at vehicle range, allow you to vary vehicle range and home charging access. The outputs that this model produces are the number of electric vehicles owned by people who live in an area. So this works at census units primarily, but we've also done it at zip codes and counties. We're also developing a more detailed, totally household level model that will say there's going to be this many 2-vehicle households with 2 BEVs in a certain income level in a certain zone. Something that gets a lot more fine-grained than what we have now, largely just because this really fine-grained level of analysis is really important for understanding charging behavior. But then, the number of EVs commuting to an area, the number of charging events at a typical workday, and then we're also working on expanding that to not just charging events, but the amount of energy demanded by these charging events at home, workplace locations, and public charging locations. We developed a few sort of baselines or target scenarios for EV adoption. This was specifically for work we did in the Delmarva Peninsula and South Carolina. These scenarios are basically a 2%. So EV fraction is the share of all vehicles on the road that are EVs. So we're going from about 2%, which is where California was a couple of years ago, to about 10%, where California will be in a couple of years from now, and up to 25%, which is roughly where California should be at about 2030. The idea is that in slower adoption states, these are all sort of future targets, but fairly believable future targets. So the low adoption scenario should be about 2030 virtually everywhere in the country. And the 10% scenario, if places manage to hit the EV sales targets, should happen by about 2035. And what you see here is that basically, whereas now electric vehicles are primarily used for commuting, almost all of them can charge at home, many of them can charge at work for free. In the future, non-commute use is going to get a lot more common. Long-range electric vehicles are already becoming more common and will continue to get that way. So in this case, long-range BEVs is battery electric vehicles with over 200 miles of range, which historically has just meant Teslas, but now Chevy Bolt and almost every new battery electric vehicle that gets introduced has more than 200 miles of range. And then also home charging access is going to decrease as more electric vehicles are purchased by people in multi-unit dwellings, and more multi-EV households maybe aren't able to charge all of their cars at home at once. The way that this tool works to look at is basically you first select a geographic layer of analysis. In this case, we have zip codes, block groups, and counties, and then adjust the scenario parameters. So you can select the low, medium, or high scenario, or you can adjust the individual parameters. If you wanted to look at the effect of a different commute fraction, different availability of long-range vehicles, different access to charging at home, things like that, and see what impact that has on both the number of electric vehicles and charging demand. Once you've developed a scenario, you can then, we'll basically have this tool to sort of allow you to export the results into a CSV, which the main idea here is that you can basically test a wide range of scenarios and then plug them into whatever analysis models that you have for the sort of going from number of charging events or kilowatt hours to figuring out how to allocate the electricity and things like that, or figure out costs or things like that. So anyways, this is basically a tool that we developed for California and other states. We're working on expanding it right now, and it's sort of an ongoing development process. But I also thought I'd end by talking a little bit about what makes Alaska possibly challenging for electric vehicles. And the list of cons here is probably ones that are going to be fairly familiar to all of you. But first off, it's very, very cold there, or more often cold in Alaska than it is in the lower 48 states. Electric vehicles generally perform worse in cold weather. This is true of many battery-powered things, but for electric vehicles, there are a lot of things that they need to do extra that internal combustion engine vehicles don't. So heating the cabin is something that can be achieved by internal combustion engine vehicles because burning gasoline is super exothermic. So they generate a lot of waste heat that you can kind of use to heat the cabin. Electric vehicles don't do that, so they have to burn a lot more energy on that. And also batteries aren't quite as happy when it's colder. So that's a concern, although Norway has reached, I think, 65% EV sales, maybe even a little bit higher. And it's also a very, very cold place with lots of long distance travel. So this is an issue, but it's not totally insurmountable. Alaska is obviously very, very, very big. This means there's a widely varied range of transportation needs, very variable conditions. This will make anything that relies on predictable access to charging a lot more difficult. Compared to the lower 48 states, there's going to be less spillover in terms of infrastructure and used vehicles. So DC fast charging has been built out in much of the rest of the country, basically to provide for long distance travel and tourism from states with higher levels of EV ownership. This isn't going to be as much of a thing in Alaska because more people fly there by plane than drive. But on the sort of less con side, more on the uncertain side, Alaska is also much less car dependent than much of the rest of the country. This plot on the right has annual vehicle miles traveled per capita. As you can see, at the sort of extreme high end, Wyoming has over 17,000 vehicle miles traveled per capita. So the average person basically in Wyoming of any age drives 18,000 miles or 17,000 miles a year.
Just a quick time check, Adam, about 1 minute left.
Awesome, thank you. Alaska has less. So this is a bit of a pro and con because electric vehicles are actually great for high mileage uses as long as it's predictable high mileage uses. But it also means that if we're trying to electrify transportation, that's going to mean thinking about things other than just conventional light duty vehicles. And then on the plus side, things that might make Alaska suitable for electric vehicles or might make the next 10 or 15 to 20 years more suitable for electric vehicles. EVs are getting better and cheaper basically everywhere. They're getting more efficient, more reliable. This is something that's happening just as more people buy them, as companies get better at manufacturing them. So they're going to basically start making more sense to everyone over the next few years. Norway's at 65% EV sales, like I said. So this is a place they're not quite as cold, obviously not as large as Alaska, but another place that has some of the same issues and has found ways to address them. And then also there's been really a lot of development in electric off-highway vehicles, which is something that's fairly important in Alaska compared to elsewhere. And investment and development in that sector is also taking off really rapidly. And one of the things we've seen in California specifically for electric bicycles is that, which is not quite at the same scale, other off-highway vehicles, but electric bicycles can kind of revolutionize what people are able to do compared to conventional bikes. And then just a sort of in closing, another thing here that just makes any kind of transportation different in Alaska than elsewhere. This is a map of the most common means of transportation to work within the US. As you can see, the lower 48 states, it's virtually all drive alone. The exceptions are San Francisco County and then the 5 boroughs of New York plus 1 in New Jersey, where transit's more common. But then in much of Alaska, walking and other modes of transportation are actually more important than driving. So like with anything in transportation planning, we have to think about all the different kind of range of needs people have and how to meet them. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's really interesting to learn about this electric vehicle adoption tool. So thank you for making the tool and thank you for sharing that with us. So with that, we are going to close the panel. And I just want to say thank you very much again to all the panelists. It just has been really exciting to learn about all this cutting edge research. So Michelle, back to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, everybody who presented and moderated today. This was wonderful. I'm really looking forward to reaching back out and talking more with many of you. Very exciting stuff. And hopefully those of you that were able to join us today also learned something and have some good information to chew on over the next afternoon and night while we wait for the exciting second day. So this concludes today's workshop. Thank everybody who was able to join us for Electrify Everything, sponsored by the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. We appreciate everybody for being here, incredible moderators, panelists, virtual attendees. If you'd like a sneak peek of tomorrow's agenda, that is on the screen right now. So I'm really excited. We have a utility perspectives panel with a discussion with utility representatives in the morning, early morning, followed by our later morning panel, where we will talk to people in industry, by which we mean people creating products to help with this transition. So we're really excited to continue this discussion with those fields, and we look forward to seeing you all back here again tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Alaska Standard or Daylight Time, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And that concludes today's presentation. So again, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.